Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Moving back to Wisconsin after my marriage imploded wasn't part of any 5-year plan I'd ever made. But there I was, sleeping on my friend Kayla's couch in Milwaukee, working double shifts as a registered nurse at Froedtert Hospital, just to keep my mind off everything. Graduation from nursing school in 2007 felt like a lifetime ago, back when I thought I had everything figured out. Most nights I'd drag myself home around midnight, peel off scrubs that smelled like sanitizer and fear, then collapse in front of whatever true crime documentary Kayla had queued up. We were halfway through one about missing persons in rural areas when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Some lawyer from Sheboygan County was calling to tell me my Aunt Dolores had died and left me her dairy farm. Aunt Dolores was basically a ghost in our family, my mother's older sister who nobody talked about except in whispers. Mom had cut her off completely before I even started elementary school, and all I knew came from a shoebox of old Christmas cards I found after Mom passed from pancreatic cancer. Each card had the same photo, a weathered woman with steel gray hair standing next to Holstein cows. No smile, just this intense stare that seemed to follow you. Gregory Paulson, the estate lawyer, explained that the farm had been non-operational for about 5 years, and that my aunt had spent her final 8 months in a memory care facility after several incidents with local law enforcement. He said that last part carefully, like he was choosing each word from a list of things he legally could and couldn't say. I drove out to the property on a Thursday morning in early October, right after finishing a brutal night shift, where we'd lost 2 patients. Maybe it was exhaustion, but I needed to see something that wasn't fluorescent lit and sanitized. The farm sat about 20 minutes outside of Plymouth, down a gravel road that my GPS kept insisting didn't exist. When I finally found it, the place looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned dairy operation to look. Main barn with its red paint flaking off like dried blood, 3 long metal-roofed sheds that used to house equipment, and the milking parlor, a low concrete building with a loading dock on one side. Weeds had taken over most of the barnyard, growing up through the cracked asphalt where trucks used to idle while loading milk. The smell hit me as soon as I opened my car door, that mix of old manure, rotting wood, and something else I couldn't place, something chemical and sharp. The milking parlor door was secured with a new padlock, which seemed weird given how deteriorated everything else looked. Paulson had given me a ring of keys, and the third one I tried clicked open smoothly, like it had been oiled recently. Inside, the afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, illuminating rows of stanchions where cows would have stood for milking. The concrete floor had been swept clean, which made no sense if this place had been shut down for 5 years. But what really made me stop and stare were the drainage grates running down the center aisle. Fresh water pooled in them, and when I knelt down to look closer, I saw hair tangled in the metal grating. Long strands, different colors and textures, wrapped around the bars like someone had been washing it down the drains. My nursing instincts kicked in and I pulled on a pair of exam gloves from my purse, carefully extracting a few strands. Definitely human hair, and a lot of it. When I stood up, that's when I noticed the stanchions themselves. These metal frames were designed to hold a cow's head in place during milking, but someone had modified them. Additional restraint points had been welded on at different heights, and the metal showed fresh scratches and wear marks around what would be wrist height for a person. Dark stains covered the concrete beneath several stations, the kind of rusty brown color I recognized from years of working in the ER. I ran my gloved finger along one of the restraint points and found deep grooves in the metal, like someone had been pulling against them hard enough to leave marks. The whole setup made me think of the psychiatric ward at my hospital, except this was built for something much worse than treating patients. I should have left right then, should have called the police or at least told someone where I was. But I kept exploring, drawn by that same morbid curiosity that makes you slow down at accident scenes. The old milk tank room was next to the parlor, and when I pushed open the heavy steel door, the smell of industrial disinfectant nearly knocked me over. Someone had been using bleach, gallons of it, recently enough that my eyes started watering. The bulk tank that would have held thousands of gallons of milk had been ripped out, leaving just the refrigeration units along the walls. But those were running, humming steadily in the darkness, their compressors clicking on and off like they were maintaining a specific temperature. When I found the light switch, what I saw made me grab the doorframe for support. The floor had been marked with tape, creating lanes and numbered sections like a morgue. Back at the main farmhouse, I found it locked up tight with boards over most of the windows. But there was a broken basement window around back, and I managed to squeeze through after clearing away the glass. The basement was full of old farm equipment and molding boxes, but a clear path had been worn through the dust to a door I hadn't noticed at first. Behind it was a small room my aunt had apparently used as an office, and it was the only clean space I'd found so far. File boxes lined one wall, each labeled with dates going back 3 years. The most recent one, dated just 9 months ago, was still on a card table in the middle of the room. Inside were dozens of spiral notebooks, the kind you'd buy at any dollar store, filled with my aunt's cramped handwriting. Each entry was dated and timed, like a security log. The entries started normal enough. Complaints about kids breaking into the barn, finding beer cans and cigarette butts. But by the second notebook, her tone had changed. She wrote about hearing diesel engines at night, seeing lights in the milking parlor when she'd go to check. She'd called the sheriff multiple times, but they'd stopped responding after a while. One entry from January really stood out. "They're using my farm for processing. I can smell the chemicals. Saw 3 vans tonight, the kind with no windows. They stayed for 4 hours. When they left, I found blood in the drain troughs. Not animal blood." She'd even taken photos, printed on regular paper and stapled to the pages. Grainy night shots of vehicles, close-ups of tire tracks, and one that made my throat close up. A blurry image of people in white coveralls wheeling gurneys from a van into the milking parlor. I spent hours in that basement office, reading through my aunt's documentation. She'd been meticulous, recording license plates, physical descriptions of anyone she saw, even sketching maps of where vehicles parked. In February, she wrote about following one of the vans into town and losing it near the industrial district. She'd gone to the police again with her evidence, but they threatened to have her committed if she didn't stop harassing them with her delusions. That's when her entries got desperate. She started writing about setting up cameras, about confronting these people herself. The last entry was dated March 15th. "They know I've been watching. Found a note under my door this morning. Just a medical bracelet with my name already printed on it. The kind they use at the state hospital. I'm packing what I can and leaving tonight." But she never made it out. According to the legal documents Paulson had given me, she was picked up by sheriff's deputies that same night, March 15th, after concerned neighbors reported her acting erratically in town. She'd been committed for psychiatric evaluation and never left the facility. I sat there in her makeshift office, surrounded by her proof that she wasn't crazy, and felt rage building in my chest. They'd silenced her, made her look insane, and kept using her property for whatever horror show they were running. I grabbed the most recent notebook and the photos, shoving them into my bag. If I could get this to the right people, maybe someone would finally listen. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable rumble of diesel engines coming up the gravel drive. I killed the flashlight on my phone and crawled to the basement window, peering through the broken glass. 2 refrigerated trucks were backing up to the loading dock of the milking parlor, their reverse lights cutting through the dusk. Behind them, a white panel van sat idling, no markings, no plates I could see from this angle. 4 people in white hazmat suits climbed out of the van, and one of them was carrying what looked like a medical cooler, the kind we use for organ transport. They moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this hundreds of times before. One of them punched a code into a keypad I hadn't even noticed on the loading dock door, and it rolled up smoothly. The interior lights blazed on, and for just a second I could see inside. Rows of stainless steel tables that definitely weren't there when I'd explored earlier. My car was parked right out front, visible to anyone who looked. They had to know someone was here. I tried to control my breathing, pressing myself against the cold basement wall, when I heard footsteps on the porch above me. The front door opened, which shouldn't have been possible since I'd left it locked. Whoever was up there knew their way around this house. I could hear them walking through the rooms, methodical, checking each one. The footsteps stopped directly above the basement door. I held my breath, gripping the notebook like it might protect me, and watched the doorknob at the top of the basement stairs slowly start to turn. That's when my phone, still in my hand from using the flashlight, lit up with an incoming call. Kayla's face filled the screen, and her ringtone echoed through the basement like an alarm. I fumbled to decline the call, but it was too late. The door flew open and heavy boots thundered down the stairs. I scrambled through the broken window, feeling glass tear through my palms, and ran harder than I ever have in my life. Behind me, someone shouted, and I heard more footsteps joining the chase. I made it to my car, keys already in my hand, and peeled out of there so fast the tires threw gravel against the barn. In my rearview mirror, I saw two figures in white hazmat suits standing in the driveway, not running, just watching. They knew they didn't need to chase me. As I hit the main road, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just a photo of my hospital ID badge, the one I'd thought I'd lost last month, along with my current address at Kayla's apartment. I drove straight to the FBI field office in Milwaukee. The notebooks and photos spread across my passenger seat. They listened, took my evidence, and said they'd investigate. 2 weeks later, an agent called to tell me they'd found the farm completely cleaned out. No trace of anything I'd described. The refrigerated trucks, the modifications to the stanchions, even the tape markings on the floor, all gone. They suggested I might have misinterpreted what I'd seen, that grief and exhaustion can play tricks on the mind. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I have my aunt's documentation to prove it. I've since moved 3 times, changed jobs twice, and I still get texts sometimes, always from different numbers, always just photos. My new apartment building, my new workplace, the coffee shop I go to every morning. They're letting me know they're watching, waiting for me to make the same mistake my aunt did. The difference is, I'm not going to the local police. I'm taking everything I have to every journalist, every true crime podcast, every investigative reporter who will listen. Someone somewhere will believe me, they have to. My grandfather built our farm in Nebraska back when Eisenhower was president, and I took it over from my dad about 12 years ago when his arthritis got too bad to keep going. Just me, my wife Melissa, and our 2 boys running 800 acres of corn and soybeans outside a town so small. You'd miss it if you blinked driving through. We weren't rich by any means, but we made enough to pay the bills, put food on the table, and even managed to set aside a little each month for the boys' college funds. Late spring of 2018 was when everything started going wrong, right when the corn was knee-high and vulnerable, right when we needed everything to go perfectly to make our loan payments for the new combine we'd bought the previous fall. It started on a Monday morning in early June when I was doing my usual rounds, checking the irrigation pivots before the day got too hot. I remember the smell hit me first. This sickly, sweet chemical odor that made my nose burn. Nothing like the usual earthy smell of wet soil and growing corn. Walking along the north field, I found a whole section of corn just dying, the leaves turning this ugly yellowish-brown color and curling up like they'd been torched. But it wasn't heat damage or disease, the pattern was too weird for that. Dead plants in perfect straight lines, then healthy ones, then more dead ones, like someone had painted stripes across my field. I called the county extension office right away, thinking maybe it was some new pest or fungus I hadn't seen before. But when their specialist came out that afternoon, she took one look and asked if I'd had any chemical spills recently. We spent the next 3 days testing soil samples and checking every piece of equipment on the farm. Nothing made sense until Thursday when more plants started dying, this time in the west field where a different irrigation line ran. The extension specialist brought in someone from the state agriculture department, a guy named Frank who'd seen pretty much everything in his 30 years on the job. He walked the fields for maybe an hour, took water samples directly from the irrigation lines, then asked me to show him where all my pivot points and main water connections were located. When he tested the water with some kind of strip kit right there in the field, his face went pale. Antifreeze, he said, enough to kill anything it touched, and it was coming through our irrigation system. My first thought was equipment failure, maybe a cracked housing on one of the pivots leaking hydraulic fluid or coolant somehow backing up into the water lines. But Frank shut that down immediately, said the concentration was way too high and too consistent for an accident. Someone was putting it in there on purpose. We called the sheriff's department, and while we waited for them to arrive, I started walking my irrigation main lines, trying to figure out how someone could even access the system. That's when I found the first cap tampered with near the edge of our property where it borders the old Brennan place that got bought up by Midwest Agricultural Holdings 2 years back. The lock I'd put on it was cut clean through with bolt cutters, and there were fresh tire tracks in the mud leading from their access road. The sheriff's deputy who showed up was a young guy named Jason, who'd gone to school with my oldest boy. He took photos, made notes, but I could tell he was in over his head with something like this. He suggested I install some trail cameras, maybe hire private security, and said they'd increase patrols but couldn't watch the place 24/7. That same afternoon, I borrowed my brother-in-law's drone to check on the damage from above, figuring I needed documentation for the insurance claim. What I saw on that little screen made me pull my truck over to the side of the road. The dead plants weren't random at all. From above, they spelled out words across my fields. Sell now stretched across the North 40, and get out written in dying corn in the West field. I drove straight to town and bought 8 security cameras with night vision, the kind hunters use, and spent Friday setting them up at every access point I could think of. Melissa thought I was being paranoid, but she hadn't seen those words carved into our livelihood. That night I barely slept, checking the camera feeds on my phone every hour, walking the perimeter with a flashlight and my dad's old shotgun. Nothing happened Friday night or Saturday, but Sunday around 3 in the morning, one of the cameras triggered. The footage was grainy but clear enough to see a figure in dark clothes carrying what looked like a 5-gallon bucket, heading straight for one of our irrigation access points. They knew exactly where to go, no hesitation, no searching around. This person had been on my property before, knew our system inside and out. I called the sheriff's emergency line and waited in my truck near the access point, watching through binoculars, while dispatch said a unit was on the way. 20 minutes felt like hours, but the person was still there, hunched over the irrigation connection. When the patrol car's lights finally appeared on the county road, the figure took off running, leaving the bucket behind. They disappeared into a drainage culvert that ran under the road toward the Midwest Agricultural property. The deputy, same young Jason from before, collected the bucket, which still had about 2 gallons of antifreeze in it, but by the time backup arrived to search the area, whoever it was had vanished. Jason mentioned something interesting though. Said those old drainage tunnels connected half the farms in the county, built back in the 60s for flood control. Most farmers had sealed their ends years ago, but apparently not everyone. Monday morning, I decided to do my own investigating. I knew Midwest Agricultural had been after my land for 3 years, ever since they started buying up farms to create what they called a consolidated growing operation. They'd made me 4 offers, each one lower than the last after I kept refusing. I drove over to their office in town, a new glass and steel building that looked ridiculous next to the feed store and hardware shop. The receptionist said their property acquisition manager would be happy to see me, probably thinking I was finally ready to sell. While I waited in the lobby, I saw their employee board on the wall, those corporate photos with names and titles. 3rd row down, there he was, clear as day. Tommy Garrett, Field Operations Supervisor. The same Tommy Garrett I'd fired 8 months earlier after catching him stealing diesel and selling equipment parts on the side. Everything clicked into place right then. Tommy knew our irrigation system because he'd helped install the new lines 2 summers ago. He knew where we kept spare keys, which fields were most crucial for our mortgage payments. Even knew about those old drainage tunnels because his uncle had worked on the original installation back in the day. I left without meeting their manager, went straight to the sheriff's office with printouts of Tommy's employee photo and my old termination paperwork. They pulled the security footage I'd captured and ran it through some enhancement software. The build matched, the gait was right, even had the same slight limp Tommy got from a motorcycle accident years back. But the deputy said matching a body shape wasn't enough for an arrest. We needed something concrete. I spent the next 2 nights sleeping in my truck near different access points, waiting. Melissa begged me to let the police handle it, but they'd made it clear they didn't have the manpower for stakeouts. On Wednesday night, I got lucky, if you can call it that. Around 2 in the morning, I saw headlights turn off the main road onto an old service path that led to the drainage tunnel entrance. I recognized the truck immediately, a beat-up Ford Ranger with a cracked taillight that Tommy used to drive to work every day. I started recording with my phone and followed on foot, staying far enough back to avoid being spotted. He went straight to the tunnel entrance with a bucket and a funnel, bold as brass, like he owned the place. I got 5 minutes of clear video before calling 911 and requesting immediate assistance, saying I had the vandal on camera actively poisoning my irrigation system. They arrested Tommy right there in the tunnel with the antifreeze, the funnel still in his hand. During the booking, he cracked pretty quickly according to Jason, who called me the next morning with updates. Tommy admitted Midwest Agricultural's acquisition manager had approached him after seeing his name in the newspaper's court records from when I'd pressed charges for the theft. They offered him double what he'd been making with me, plus a bonus for every farmer who agreed to sell after crop failures. He gave up everything, the payment records, text messages from his supervisor, encouraging him to increase the pressure, even emails discussing which farms to target next. The state attorney general got involved after that, launching an investigation into Midwest Agricultural's practices across 3 counties. Turns out, we weren't the only farm experiencing mysterious problems right before receiving lowball offers. The legal case took almost a year to fully resolve, but Tommy got 18 months in prison for criminal damage to property and conspiracy charges. Midwest Agricultural settled out of court for enough to cover my losses plus extra. That let us pay off the combine and put new security systems across the entire property. They also lost their business license in the state after investigators found similar schemes in 2 other counties. The drainage tunnels got sealed properly by the county after my story made the local news, and other farmers started checking their old access points too. Some found evidence of tampering they'd never noticed before. My corn grew back strong the next season once we flushed the entire irrigation system twice and replaced all the contaminated soil. These days, I still check those cameras every night before bed, and I keep the shotgun closer than I used to. But at least now when my crops fail, I know it's just weather or bad luck, not someone trying to force me off land my family worked for 3 generations. Route 47 runs through farmland for about 60 miles before it hits any real town. And right at mile marker 31, there's a little wooden produce stand that's been there since before I was born. Grandma Rose and Grandpa Bill built it themselves after he retired from the railroad, painted it barn red with white trim, and they've been running it on the honor system ever since. Just vegetables in baskets, a price list written on cardboard, and a metal cash box with a slot cut in the top bolted to the counter. No cameras, no locks on the vegetables, just pure trust that people would pay what they owed. For 37 years, it worked perfectly. Folks would stop by, grab their tomatoes or corn or whatever was in season, drop their money through the slot, and drive off. Some regular customers even left notes thanking them for the best squash in the county, or asking them to save a dozen ears of corn for Sunday dinner. That Saturday in August when I drove out to help with fence repairs, I expected to spend the day digging post holes and listening to Grandpa tell stories about his railroad days. Grandma Rose met me at the door in her sunflower apron, but instead of her usual cheerful greeting, she grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen, where Grandpa was sitting at the table with a manila envelope in front of him. His jaw was clenched, the way it gets when he's trying not to show he's upset, and he pushed the envelope across the table toward me without saying anything. Inside were 5 photographs, all taken in their bedroom while they slept. The first one showed them from the doorway, covers pulled up to their chins. Grandma's white hair spread across the pillow. The second was closer, focused on Grandpa's nightstand where his heart medication was lined up next to his reading glasses and the old wind-up alarm clock they'd had since their wedding. The third showed Grandma's side of the bed, her breathing machine on the table, the cord running to her face. The fourth was taken from the foot of the bed, showing both their faces slack with sleep. The fifth one made my chest tighten. It was shot from directly above them, as if someone had been standing right there, leaning over their bodies in the dark. Grandpa said they'd found the envelope that morning when they went to collect yesterday's earnings. Maybe $300 worth of vegetables sold, but not a penny in the box. Just the envelope, folded tight to fit through the slot. What scared me most was how recent the photos looked. Grandma had just gotten that new quilted bedspread with the yellow roses last week, and there it was in every picture. These weren't old photos someone had found somewhere. Someone had been in their house within the past few days, maybe even last night, walking through their hallways, standing over them while they slept, close enough to smell Grandpa's aftershave on the dresser, close enough to read the labels on Grandma's pills. They hadn't heard anything, hadn't noticed any broken locks or jimmied windows. Their old lab, Butterscotch, who usually barked at every passing car, hadn't made a sound. Whoever took these pictures knew exactly how to get in, knew exactly when my grandparents would be deepest in sleep, knew that Grandpa took his hearing aids out at night and wouldn't hear footsteps on those creaky stairs. I wanted to call the police right away, but Grandpa had already tried that. Deputy Hanson came out, took a report, looked at the photos, checked the doors and windows, and basically told them there wasn't much he could do. No theft, technically. No property damage. No direct threats made. Just someone being creepy, he said. Probably local kids playing a sick prank before school started back up. He suggested they install motion lights and maybe get a security camera for the produce stand, then drove off in his cruiser, leaving my 81-year-old grandparents to figure out how someone had been walking around their bedroom while they slept. Grandma Rose kept staring at that fifth photograph, the one from above, and she quietly asked me if I could stay the weekend. Her voice had this tremor I'd never heard before, not even when she was telling me about her cancer diagnosis 2 years back. She said she couldn't shake the image of someone standing there, breathing in the dark above them, maybe reaching out a hand toward their faces, maybe thinking about doing something worse than just taking pictures. Of course I said yes, and we spent the rest of that morning changing all the locks, me driving to the hardware store 3 towns over because Grandpa insisted on getting the expensive deadbolts, the ones that couldn't be picked. While I was installing them, I kept thinking about the logistics of those photos. Their bedroom was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway that creaked with every step. You had to pass 3 other doors to get there, including the bathroom with its noisy pocket door that Grandpa kept meaning to fix. The stairs had their own symphony of squeaks and groans that I could map out from memory. 3rd step from the bottom, 7th, and the very top one that sounded like a gunshot if you hit it wrong. Yet someone had navigated all of that in complete silence, spent enough time in their bedroom to take 5 different photos from 5 different angles, and left without disturbing anything. Not a picture frame out of place, not a drawer cracked open, nothing except those photographs left in exchange for a day's worth of hard-earned money. That afternoon, while my grandparents tried to maintain their normal routine in the garden, I decided to check out the old barn behind the house. It had been built in the 1940s, back when the property was a working dairy farm, and now it mostly held gardening equipment, bags of fertilizer, and about 40 years' worth of things they couldn't bear to throw away. The main floor was packed with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, broken appliances waiting to be fixed, and towers of yellowing newspapers that Grandma swore she'd go through someday. But when I climbed the ladder to the hayloft, I noticed something that made me call out for my grandfather to come quick. The dust up there had been disturbed in a wide area near the loading door that faced the house. Fresh scratches marked the floor where something had been dragged repeatedly. In the corner, hidden behind some old feed sacks, was a makeshift living space. A sleeping bag, several water bottles, empty food cans with the labels peeled off, a battery-powered lantern, and a pair of binoculars. The binoculars were pointed through a gap in the wall boards, aimed directly at my grandparents' bedroom window. Grandpa Bill climbed up behind me, moving pretty fast for someone his age, and when he saw that setup, his whole face changed. He picked up something I hadn't noticed at first, a spiral notebook tucked under the sleeping bag, its pages wrinkled from humidity. He opened it with shaking fingers, and we both read the first page together. It was a schedule, written in neat block letters. 5:30 a.m., Bill gets up, bathroom, lets dog out. 5:45 a.m., Rose gets up, starts coffee. 6:15 a.m., both in garden until 7:30. 8 a.m., breakfast at kitchen table by window. 9 a.m., Bill to produce stand. Rose does laundry Mondays and Fridays. It went on like that for pages, documenting their entire routine down to the minute, when they watched their evening news program, when they took their medications, when Butterscotch got his last walk of the night. There were notes in the margins, too. Bill's beta blocker makes him dizzy if he stands too fast. And Rose's breathing machine needs power. Check backup generator location. And dog sleeps in mudroom. Close interior door first. But it was the later pages that made Grandpa grab my arm hard enough to leave marks. The dates went back 3 weeks, and the entries got more detailed, more personal. Rose cried today looking at photo album. Daughter died young? Check cemetery records. Another one said, Bill's hands shaking worse. Parkinson's, research medication interactions. There were sketches of the house layout, marking which floorboards creaked, which windows had broken latches that looked locked from outside but weren't, where the spare key was hidden under the fake rock by the cellar door. One page had a list of their medications with dosages, their doctors' names, their social security numbers somehow, their bank information copied from a statement that must have been in their mail. At the bottom of that page, circled 3 times in red pen, tonight, final documentation before next phase. The date next to it was today's date, Saturday, August 12th. We called Deputy Hanson again, and this time he actually seemed concerned. While we waited for him to arrive, Grandpa and I searched the rest of the barn, finding more evidence that someone had been living there for weeks. There was a camp stove hidden behind some lumber, more notebooks filled with observations about everyone who stopped at the produce stand, license plate numbers, physical descriptions, what they bought, how much money they left. One regular customer, a woman who bought tomatoes every Monday, had 3 pages dedicated to her. Her approximate age, the wedding ring she wore, the medical scrubs that suggested she worked at the hospital 2 towns over, speculation about her shift schedule based on when she stopped by. The detail was obsessive, the handwriting getting smaller and more cramped as the pages went on, like the person writing couldn't stop themselves from documenting every single thing they observed. Deputy Hanson arrived with another officer, and they took the notebooks as evidence, photographed the makeshift camp, dusted for fingerprints. They found dozens of prints, fresh ones, all over the barn ladder, the sleeping bag, the binoculars. While they worked, I stayed with my grandparents in the house, all of us sitting in the living room, not talking much, just waiting. Around 4 in the afternoon, Hanson came back with news that made my grandmother reach for her rosary. The fingerprints matched a man named Claude Brenner, who had been released from the state psychiatric facility 6 weeks ago. He'd been institutionalized for 5 years after being found guilty but mentally ill in a case involving an elderly couple in another county. He'd convinced them he was their grandson who died in infancy, lived with them for 2 months, slowly taking over their lives, their finances, until a neighbor noticed something was wrong and called the authorities. The couple had been so confused by then, so medicated with drugs he'd been slipping into their food, that they couldn't even remember their own names. The police put out an immediate alert and stationed an officer at the house, but Brenner was already gone. They found him 3 hours later at a bus station 40 miles away, carrying a backpack with my grandparents' photos, more notebooks, and a bottle of crushed pills that matched Grandma's heart medication, mixed with something else the lab would later identify as a powerful sedative. He'd been grinding them together, planning to put them in something, probably their food or the water bottles they kept by their bed. The arrest was quiet. He didn't resist, didn't say anything, just stared at the officers with this blank expression that Deputy Hansen later described as the most unsettling thing he'd seen in 20 years of police work. During the booking, they found more photographs in his pockets, not just of my grandparents, but of 3 other elderly couples in neighboring counties, all with produce stands or farm stores, all running on trust and honor systems, all with detailed notes about their routines, their medications, their isolation from neighbors, their vulnerability. My grandparents moved in with me after that. They couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sleep in that bedroom knowing someone had stood over them in the dark, documenting their every breath. The produce stand stayed closed for the rest of that summer and never reopened. Grandpa took down the hand-painted sign himself, his hand steady for once, and burned it along with those photographs in a barrel behind the barn. Brenner went back to the psychiatric facility, this time with no possibility of release, but the damage was done. My grandmother never slept through the night again, always waking at the slightest sound, checking the locks, peering out windows. Grandpa stopped taking his hearing aids out at night, preferring the feedback whistle to the vulnerability of silence. They lived another 3 years, passing within months of each other, and I sometimes wonder if they ever had a moment of real peace after that day. The house sold to a young family who knew nothing about what had happened there, and I drive past sometimes, seeing kids playing in the yard where the produce stand used to be, that patch of grass where trust died one August morning when photographs replaced money in a simple wooden box. Most folks in Millbrook knew me as the kid who bagged groceries at Hannaford and helped old ladies carry their bags to their cars. 26 and still living in my childhood bedroom. But hey, at least I had a purpose now. 6 months into volunteer firefighting, and I finally felt like I belonged to something bigger than scanning barcodes and mopping floors. Captain Holbrook had taken me under his wing right from the start. Same man who used to give me $5 to rake leaves when I was 12. He taught me everything: how to read smoke patterns, how to vent a roof properly, how to stay calm when everyone else was losing their minds. Saturday nights were usually quiet in our town, population barely pushing 3,000, so when my pager went off at 11:43, I figured someone had left their stove on again. Rolling out of bed, I grabbed my gear from the hallway closet, where Mom always complained it made the whole house smell like smoke. Radio chatter was minimal, just dispatch calling out a structure fire at the old Jameson property on Deer Run Road. That farm had been sold 8 months ago to a couple from Boston, the Andersons, I think, who'd been renovating the place piece by piece. Nice people, always waved when they drove past, though some folks at the diner grumbled about city people driving up property taxes. I remembered them coming into the store a few weeks back, asking about those hikers who went missing last fall, said they were writing some kind of article for a travel blog. Strange thing to write about, but city people had different ideas about interesting topics, I guess. As I pulled on my boots, something nagged at me about that property, about how the previous owners, the Greenwalds, had left so suddenly last year, supposedly for a job opportunity in California, leaving half their furniture behind. My pickup struggled to start in the cold, engine turning over 3 times before finally catching. Deer Run Road was 15 minutes out, winding through pine forest and past the old quarry, where teenagers used to party before that girl drowned there in '98. No other volunteers had responded yet, according to dispatch, which wasn't unusual for a Saturday night when half the department was probably at Moose Lodge or already 3 beers deep at home. The scanner crackled with updates. Fully involved structure, barn not the main house, no injuries reported. Good. At least the Andersons were safe. But as I drove, I kept thinking about the other fires we'd had recently. The Nguyens' tool shed in September, that nice black family's gazebo, The Washingtons, just after Labor Day. All newcomers to town, all within their first year here, all ruled accidental by the state fire marshal. Captain Holbrook had handled the reports himself, said it was probably just coincidence, maybe faulty electrical work by the same cheap contractor. When I crested the hill before the property, orange light painted the sky like a wound against the darkness. The barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting 30 feet through the collapsed roof. But something was wrong with the scene. No other trucks, no flashing lights, just my headlights cutting through smoke that drifted across the gravel driveway. The Andersons' house sat dark about 200 yards away. No lights on, no cars in the driveway. Nobody standing outside watching their building burn. Protocol said to wait for backup, never go interior alone. But I could hear the structure groaning, beams cracking like gunshots in the heat. Around back, I noticed a stone foundation separate from the barn. An old root cellar, probably original to the property. The metal door was propped open with a rock, smoke lazily pooling out but no flames visible. If there was anything salvageable, any family heirlooms or equipment the Andersons had stored, it would be down there, and I had maybe 10 minutes before the whole structure came down on top of it. The cellar steps were carved limestone, worn smooth by a century of footsteps, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as I descended. My flashlight beam cut through the haze, revealing a space about 12 by 15 feet, stone walls sweating with moisture and heat from above. What I saw there made me stop breathing. The walls were lined with mason jars, dozens of them on wooden shelves, but they weren't filled with preserves or vegetables. Each jar contained personal effects: watches, rings, wallets, car keys with rental tags still attached. Polaroid camera sat on the middle shelf, next to stacks of photographs rubber-banded together. I pulled out one stack, and my light caught faces I recognized. The Greenwalds at what looked like a town meeting, circled in red marker. The Nguyens at the farmer's market, same red circle. The Washingtons at the 4th of July parade just 2 months ago. Every photo showed newcomers to town, all circled, all with dates written on the back in careful handwriting I knew too well. My legs went weak when I saw the far wall. Children's backpacks hung on hooks, names written on tags: Amy Greenwald, age 7, David Nguyen, age 9. Below them, a milk crate filled with toys still muddy from wherever they'd been buried, a pink bicycle helmet with unicorn stickers, a Nintendo Switch with property of Alex Washington etched on the back. These families hadn't moved away for new jobs or better schools. They never left Millbrook at all. In the corner, 3 blue tarps covered shapes I didn't want to identify, flies buzzing despite the November cold. The smell hit me then, sweet and cloying, cutting through the smoke. I grabbed the Polaroid camera and as many photos as I could stuff into my jacket, knowing nobody would believe me without proof. That's when I heard the footsteps on the limestone stairs, slow and deliberate, and Captain Holbrook's voice calling down, asking if I'd found anything interesting. He filled the doorway, still in his civilian clothes, jeans and that old Carhartt jacket he wore to every town council meeting. In his right hand, a red gas can swung gently, the kind we kept at the station for the lawn equipment. His left hand stayed in his pocket, wrapped around something angular that pushed against the fabric. The smile on his face was the same one he'd worn when he taught me to tie bowline knots, when he'd pinned my badge on my uniform 6 months ago. But his eyes were empty, flat like a deer's eyes in headlights. He came down 3 more steps, blocking my only exit, and I could smell the gasoline on his clothes mixing with cologne his wife always bought him for Christmas. "You weren't supposed to be on shift tonight," he said, voice gentle like he was talking to a spooked horse. "Dispatch wasn't supposed to page anyone except me. Computer glitch, I guess." "Captain," I started, but my voice cracked like I was 13 again. He shook his head slowly, sadly, like I'd disappointed him by not cleaning the trucks properly. The gas can made a sloshing sound as he set it on the step beside him. "Your mother would be heartbroken," he said, and something about the way he used the conditional tense made my knees buckle. 43 years I've kept this town safe, kept it pure, kept outsiders from ruining what we built here. My father did it before me, his father before him. You think those families were innocent? They came here digging, investigating, trying to destroy our way of life. The Andersons were asking about the hikers, connecting dots that didn't need connecting. He pulled his hand from his pocket, and I saw the revolver, an old Smith & Wesson police special. I trained you because I thought you understood loyalty. Small towns survive by taking care of their own, not by welcoming every stranger who wants to change us. The barn above us groaned, a beam crashing down somewhere, shaking dust from the cellar ceiling. In that moment of distraction, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the milk crate full of toys and hurled it at him. Plastic and metal scattered across the stairs as he stumbled backward, the gun firing once into the stone wall beside my head, chips of rock stinging my face. I bowled past him, taking the stairs 3 at a time, him shouting behind me about ungrateful kids and necessary evils. The barn was fully collapsing now, walls folding inward like a house of cards in slow motion. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling for keys with numb fingers, the Polaroids burning against my chest inside my jacket. In the rearview mirror, I saw him emerge from the cellar, silhouetted against the inferno, just standing there watching me drive away. He didn't chase. He didn't need to. Where was I going to go? Who would believe me over a decorated fire captain with 4 decades of service? I drove straight through town, past the police station where his brother-in-law worked nights, past the fire station where his nephew was probably washing trucks, past my house where Mom would be waiting up with coffee and questions. My phone rang constantly, dispatch, other volunteers, numbers I didn't recognize. At the interstate on-ramp, I finally pulled over and threw up in the ditch, bile mixing with the taste of smoke. The photos were still in my jacket, evidence of at least 15 families over who knows how many years. Some of the names I remembered from childhood. The Patel family who'd owned the gas station briefly in 2009. The young couple who'd tried to open that vegetarian restaurant. All moved away according to town gossip. Always suddenly, always leaving things behind. The nearest FBI field office was in Albany, 3 hours south. I had a quarter tank of gas, $37 in my wallet, and no idea if I'd make it there alive. But I did make it. Drove through the night with my doors locked and mirrors constantly checked, stopping only once for gas in a crowded station near Saratoga Springs, where I figured they couldn't do anything with witnesses around. The federal building security guard looked at me strange when I walked in at 5 in the morning, reeking of smoke, clutching wrinkled Polaroids like my life depended on them. Which it did. The agent they assigned to me, a young woman named Agent Reeves, went pale when she saw the photos. Paler still when I told her about the cellar, the jars, the children's belongings. By noon, Millbrook was swarming with FBI vehicles, state police, forensic teams. They found the cellar intact. Holbrook had fled but left everything behind, probably figuring he'd burned the only witness. They found more than just those 3 shapes under the tarps. The old quarry where kids used to party? 23 bodies recovered. The abandoned well behind the elementary school? 14 more. Generations of victims, anyone who asked too many questions, anyone who didn't fit their idea of what the town should be. Holbrook was arrested 2 days later trying to cross into Canada, the gasoline smell still on his clothes. His brother-in-law, his nephew, half the police force, even our town selectmen, 17 arrests total when the investigation ended 8 months later. Mom had to move in with my sister in Connecticut after the death threat started. Couldn't even go to Hannaford without people calling her a traitor's mother. I testified for 3 different trials. Told the same story each time about that night in November, about the photos and the toys and the smile on the face of the man who taught me to save lives. Some nights I wake up still tasting smoke, still feeling those limestone steps under my boots. The FBI got me into witness protection eventually, set me up with a new name in a new state where nobody knows about Millbrook or what happened there. I work in IT now, fixing computers in a cubicle with no windows. But sometimes when I'm driving through small towns for work and I see those volunteer firefighter stickers on pickup trucks, I wonder how many other Millbrooks are out there, how many other Captain Holbrooks are training young kids to protect their communities, and what exactly they think that means. When my sister Vanessa called about splitting the cost on a farmhouse rental for our parents' 40th anniversary, I figured it would be one of those awkward but necessary family obligations. Our parents, Doug and Janet, had been dropping hints about wanting all of us together for months. And honestly, after the mess of the past few years, scattering across different states, barely keeping in touch, I thought maybe it would be good for us. The place Vanessa found was listed as a century-old farmhouse on 80 acres in rural Pennsylvania, about 3 hours from Philadelphia where I live. The photos showed weathered wood siding, a wraparound porch, and fields that stretched to a tree line in the distance. It looked isolated in that peaceful way people pay premium prices for. Vanessa handled the booking through some vacation rental site, communicated with a property manager named Howard through email, and wired the deposit. Simple enough. We planned to arrive Friday evening in early September, spend the weekend reconnecting, and head home Monday morning. I arrived first, around 6 in the evening, with my daughter Chloe, who had just turned 11 that July. My wife Jessica was supposed to come but got stuck covering someone's shift at the hospital where she works as a surgical nurse, so it ended up being just me and Chloe making the drive. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel driveway that curved through overgrown fields, the kind where you couldn't see the main road anymore once you were halfway down. The house itself looked exactly like the photos, maybe a bit more worn, paint peeling near the roof lines but charming in that rustic way. There was a detached barn about 50 yards behind the house, doors hanging crooked on their hinges. No other buildings in sight, no neighbors visible, just fields and woods pressing in from all sides. I grabbed our bags from the trunk while Chloe stretched her legs, complaining about the long drive. A lockbox hung on the front door handle, and inside was a key just like Howard's email had described. The door opened with a long creak, and we stepped into a dim hallway that smelled like old wood and something faintly chemical, maybe cleaning supplies. The place had clearly been furnished from estate sales. Mismatched furniture, floral couches, a dining table that wobbled when I set my keys on it. But it was clean enough, and there were 6 bedrooms upstairs, plenty of space for all of us. Vanessa and her husband Keith showed up about 40 minutes later, followed by my brother Todd and his girlfriend Amber within the hour. My parents arrived last, pulling up just as the sun started dropping behind the tree line, painting everything in that orange-gold light that makes old houses look either beautiful or haunted, depending on your mood. Mom immediately started fussing over the kitchen, unpacking the groceries they'd brought, while Dad inspected the fireplace like he knew anything about masonry. We settled into our rooms, Chloe claiming the smallest bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway, because it had wallpaper with faded butterflies that she thought was cute. I took the room next to hers, a larger space with 2 windows overlooking the front yard and that barn in the distance. The windows didn't lock properly, I noticed. The mechanisms were old and loose, but I figured we were in the middle of nowhere. What did it matter? We ordered pizza from a place 20 minutes away that actually delivered out here, and spent the evening playing board games around that wobbly dining table, drinking beer, catching up on the surface-level stuff families talk about when they haven't been close in a while. Everyone seemed tired from the drive, so by 11 we'd all headed to our rooms. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to Chloe standing in my doorway. The hallway light was off, but enough moonlight came through my window that I could see her silhouette, small and still, not moving. I sat up, immediately alert the way you get when your kid appears in the night, thinking she might be sick or had a nightmare. But when I asked what was wrong, she just stood there for a few seconds before saying in this flat voice that someone was watching her window. Not that she thought someone was outside, not that she heard something, but that someone was watching her window. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made the hair on my arm stand up. I got out of bed, walked her back to her room, and checked the window. Nothing outside but darkness and the faint outline of the barn. The field stretched empty under the moon. I told her it was probably just the unfamiliar place. Strange houses always feel weird the first night, and she climbed back into bed. But she kept staring at the smoke detector on her ceiling, this round white plastic thing mounted right above the foot of her bed. She said it looked like it was pointing at her. I laughed it off, told her smoke detectors don't point anywhere, they just sit there. But even as I said it, I found myself looking at the thing. It did seem angled somehow, not flush with the ceiling but tilted slightly downward, probably just installed wrong. I kissed her forehead, told her to try to sleep, and went back to my room. But I left both our doors open just in case. Saturday morning started normal enough. Mom made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, while Dad complained about the coffee maker being too complicated. Chloe seemed fine, chattering with Amber about some video game, and I figured the night fears had passed like they usually do in daylight. We spent the morning exploring the property, walking through the fields, checking out the barn, which was mostly empty except for some rusted farm equipment and bird nests in the rafters. Todd found an old well that had been covered with rotting boards, and we all agreed to steer clear of it. The weather held perfect, clear and warm, and for a few hours it actually felt like the relaxing family weekend Vanessa had promised. But then, while we were having lunch on the porch, Chloe brought it up again. She was picking at her sandwich, not really eating, and suddenly asked if anyone else's room had a smoke detector that looked weird. Vanessa laughed and said all smoke detectors look weird. They're just plastic discs. But Chloe insisted, said hers looked different, like it had a dark spot in the center like a little black circle. Keith, who works in building inspection or something like that, got curious and said he'd take a look. We went upstairs, the whole group of us trailing behind like it was some kind of expedition, and Keith stood on Chloe's bed to examine the detector up close. He went quiet for a long moment, tilting his head, and then he carefully twisted the detector off its mounting bracket. The thing came away from the ceiling with a plasticky click, and Keith turned it over in his hands, studying it. Then he looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between confused and concerned, and said there was definitely a camera lens embedded in the center. A tiny one, maybe 4 millimeters across, positioned right where the detector's indicator light should be. For a second, nobody said anything. Vanessa made a joke about paranoid landlords checking for parties, but her voice had that edge to it, that nervous laugh people do when something isn't actually funny. Keith unscrewed the back panel, revealing a small circuit board, a battery pack, and what looked like a memory card slot. This wasn't some cheap nanny cam you buy online. This was installed professionally, made to look exactly like a standard smoke detector, the kind you'd never notice unless you specifically went looking for it. My chest got tight, that feeling when your brain is trying to catch up with what you're seeing, and I immediately started thinking about Chloe sleeping under that thing, about all of us moving around the house completely unaware. Todd said we should check the other rooms right now, and we spread out through the house like we were searching for something we'd lost, except we were looking for more violations. We found 5 more. 1 in each bedroom, all disguised as smoke detectors, all positioned with clear views of the beds. Keith also found 1 in the main bathroom, tucked inside what looked like an air freshener mounted on the wall across from the shower. The living room had 1 hidden in a digital clock on the mantel, lens pointed at the couch. Every single one had a memory card. Every single one had been recording. My hands started shaking when I held the camera from my own room, thinking about how I'd changed clothes, how I'd sat on the bed scrolling through my phone in my boxers, how utterly exposed we'd all been without knowing it. Vanessa immediately tried calling Howard, the property manager, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried 4 more times, same result. Then she tried the customer service line for the rental website, got put on hold for 15 minutes, and finally reached someone who said they'd open a case but couldn't guarantee when they'd hear back from the property owner. The person on the phone seemed more concerned about potential refunds than the fact that we'd been surveilled in our beds. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, Dad pacing and muttering about lawyers, and Chloe had gone completely silent, sitting on the stairs hugging her knees. Keith suggested we leave immediately, pack up and get out, But Todd said we should call the police first, document everything, make sure this got reported properly. I agreed with Todd. This wasn't just creepy, this was criminal, and whoever installed these cameras needed to be held accountable. Vanessa found the non-emergency number for the local sheriff's office and explained the situation to whoever answered. They said they'd send a deputy out, but it might take an hour or more since we were pretty far outside town limits. While we waited, I started looking around more carefully, not just at obvious spots, but at everything. The vents, the light fixtures, the corners of rooms. I noticed the kitchen had a small hole drilled in the cabinet above the sink, barely visible, and when I opened the cabinet, I found another camera wedged between dishes, pointed down at the counter and table. This person, whoever they were, had spent time planning this, drilling, wiring, hiding these things in ways that looked completely natural. It wasn't some spur-of-the-moment pervert setup. This was methodical. I thought about how the listing photos had shown the house empty, no furniture, and realized all of this had probably been installed recently, specifically for renters. Keith lined up all 7 cameras we'd found on the dining table, and we just stared at them. These little pieces of plastic and circuitry that had stolen our privacy, our sense of safety. While we waited for the deputy, Keith decided to walk down the driveway to see if he could get better cell reception and try calling Howard again. He was gone maybe 20 minutes when he came back walking fast, almost jogging, with this look on his face that made everyone stop talking. He'd run into a neighbor, an older woman who lived about half a mile down the road in a small brick house we'd passed on the way in. Keith said he'd asked her if she knew anything about the property or the owner, just making conversation, and she'd given him this long look before asking if we were the ones renting the farmhouse. When Keith said yes, she'd told him we should leave. Not suggested, told. She said the last 3 groups who'd rented the place had all left in the middle of the night, suddenly, without warning. She didn't know why exactly, but one family had knocked on her door around 3 in the morning looking terrified, asking to use her phone, saying they needed to call the police. She'd let them inside, but by the time any officers arrived the next morning, the family was already gone, never came back. Then she mentioned something that made my stomach turn. Said that about 2 months ago, another rental family's car was found abandoned on Route 134, about 5 miles from here. Doors open, engine still running, but nobody inside. The police searched for them, she said, but as far as she knew, they never found anything conclusive. The room went dead silent. Amber started crying, not loud, just tears running down her face, and Vanessa kept saying, "This can't be real. This can't be real," like repeating it would somehow change things. Dad wanted to know why the hell this woman didn't warn people before they rented the place, and Keith said she told him she'd tried calling the rental company multiple times, but they never took the listing down. My brain was spinning, trying to make sense of it. Were the cameras connected to something? Was someone watching in real time? The memory card suggested recording for later, but what if there was a live feed too? What if whoever installed these knew we'd found them? Todd grabbed the cameras off the table and smashed 2 of them against the floor, stomping on the pieces, like destroying them would somehow erase what had already happened. I pulled Chloe close, felt her trembling against me, and told everyone we needed to get our stuff and leave right now. Forget the deputy. Forget documenting anything. Just get out. But Mom pointed out that it was already getting dark outside, the sun dropping fast, and she didn't want to drive those narrow country roads in the dark when we were all this shaken up. Vanessa argued we should at least wait for the police, have them escort us out, make sure we were safe. The problem was nobody's phone had service anymore, not even one bar, like something had changed in the last hour. Keith checked the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall, one of those old rotary types that seemed decorative. But when he picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just dead silence. That's when I noticed the cars. Through the kitchen window, I could see all 3 vehicles parked in the gravel area near the porch, and something about them looked wrong. I walked outside, the others following, and immediately saw that every single tire had been slashed, clean cuts in the sidewalls, rubber peeling away from the rims. Someone had done this quietly, precisely, while we were all inside focused on the cameras. My truck, Vanessa's SUV, my parents' sedan, all of them useless. The sun had nearly set now, just a thin line of red on the horizon, and the fields around us looked darker than they should, shadows stretching long and strange. Todd started shouting about how we needed weapons, something to defend ourselves with, and he ran toward the barn. Dad yelled at him to stay close, but Todd was already halfway there, moving fast through the tall grass. The rest of us stood frozen in the driveway, watching him disappear into the dark mouth of the barn entrance. He was inside maybe 30 seconds before we heard him scream. Not a startled yelp, but a genuine scream of terror. And then nothing. Keith and Dad ran toward the barn while I pushed Chloe and the others back toward the house, telling them to lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone. I followed Keith and Dad, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And when we reached the barn entrance, I grabbed a rusted piece of rebar from the ground, something solid in my hands. Inside, the barn was almost pitch black, just enough dying light coming through gaps in the walls to see shapes. We called Todd's name, heard nothing back, and then Keith's flashlight from his phone clicked on, beam cutting through the dark. Todd was sitting against the far wall, knees pulled up, staring at something on the ground in front of him. When we got closer, I saw what had made him scream. Bags, black plastic contractor bags, 5 of them, lined up against the wall, and one had split open, revealing clothes inside. A child's sneaker, a woman's purse, things that clearly belonged to people. The smell hit me then. Not death exactly, but something chemical and wrong, like bleach mixed with decay. These were belongings from the other renters, had to be, trophies or evidence or whatever sick thing this was. Todd was hyperventilating, saying we're going to die out here over and over, and Dad slapped him across the face, not hard, but enough to snap him back. We pulled Todd to his feet and got out of that barn, running back to the house where everyone was pressed against the windows watching us. Once inside, we locked every door, every window we could reach, pushed furniture against the entrances, and huddled in the living room with whatever makeshift weapons we'd grabbed. Kitchen knives, a fireplace poker, that piece of rebar I still hadn't let go of. Chloe wouldn't stop shaking, and Mom held her while whispering prayers I hadn't heard since I was a kid. We kept the lights off, didn't want to be visible, and waited in the dark, listening to every creak of the old house settling, every rustle of wind outside. Hours crawled by, felt like days, and nobody slept. Around midnight, we heard an engine in the distance, growing louder, and headlights swept across the windows. A vehicle pulled into the driveway, and through a gap in the curtains I saw it was a sheriff's cruiser, light bar dark, moving slowly toward the house. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed, and Dad was already moving toward the door when Keith grabbed his arm and said, "Wait." Something about the way the cruiser stopped, about 50 feet from the porch, engine idling but nobody getting out, made Keith hesitate. We watched for maybe 2 full minutes and the driver never emerged, never called out, just sat there in the dark cab. Then the headlights cut out and the engine died, and we heard a car door open and close, but still nobody appeared. Keith whispered that real cops don't behave like that. They announce themselves, they use their radios, and my skin went cold understanding what he meant. Whoever was out there wanted us to come outside, wanted us to think we were being rescued, so we'd unlock the doors and make ourselves vulnerable. We stayed silent, barely breathing, and after what felt like forever, we heard footsteps crunching on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the house. They stopped at each window, each door, testing, checking, and when they reached the back door, the knob rattled violently like someone was trying to force it. Amber started crying again, louder this time, and Vanessa clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. The rattling stopped. Then we heard boots on the porch steps, heavy and unhurried, and I realized whoever this was knew we were trapped, knew we had nowhere to go and was taking their time. Dad whispered that we should rush whoever it was, all of us together, overpower them and take the cruiser. But before anyone could respond, we heard another engine. This one different, rougher, and more headlights flooded the driveway. A pickup truck pulled up fast, real police lights flashing, and a woman's voice shouted through a megaphone identifying herself as Deputy Carver, asking if anyone was inside the residence. The footsteps on the porch ran fast toward the tree line, and I heard the fake cruiser's engine roar to life and tear out of the driveway in the opposite direction. We unlocked the door, stumbled outside, and I've never been so grateful to see another human being in my life. Deputy Carver had actually been trying to reach us for hours after receiving our call, but kept getting sent to the wrong address by her GPS until she finally asked at a gas station and the clerk recognized the property description. She called for backup immediately when she saw our slashed tires and heard what had happened, and within 40 minutes the driveway was full of police vehicles, real ones this time, with more deputies and 2 state troopers. They searched the barn, photographed everything, bagged the evidence, and found the fake cruiser abandoned 3 miles down a service road, stolen from an impound lot 2 counties over. The property manager, Howard, turned out to be a fabricated identity, emails routed through proxy servers, payment processed through a shell account that led nowhere. The actual property owner was an elderly man in a nursing home whose family had listed the farmhouse for sale 18 months ago, had no idea it was being rented out illegally, and was horrified when detectives showed up asking questions. They never caught whoever did this. The cameras, the surveillance, the belongings in the barn, none of it led to an arrest, just an open investigation that I check on every few months and always find the same status: ongoing. We gave statements until dawn, and the police arranged for a tow truck and a van to get us out of there. Chloe doesn't talk about that weekend, not even to her therapist, and Jessica and I decided not to push her. The rental website pulled the listing and settled with us out of court, along with 2 other families who came forward with similar stories after seeing news coverage. I still don't know what would have happened if Deputy Carver hadn't shown up when she did, and honestly, I don't want to know. What I do know is that I check every smoke detector now, every mirror, every electronic device in any place I stay, and I probably always will. Uncle Vincent called me on a Friday morning in July 2016, asking if I wanted to make $50 helping him check his trail cameras before deer season prep started. I'd just finished my junior year of high school the month before, and spending my 17th summer broke didn't sound appealing, so I jumped at it. Vincent owned about 40 acres of mixed woodland and clearings about 2 miles from our house, land that had been in our family since my grandfather bought it in the 60s. The property bordered state forest on 2 sides, which made it prime for deer movement, and Vincent was meticulous about his hunting prep. He had 8 trail cameras set up at various points, motion-activated things that snapped photos whenever something passed by. Usually it was just deer, sometimes a coyote or a bear. That morning, the sky had that hazy quality that promised heat later, and I remember thinking it'd be nice to be in the woods before it got too miserable. Living out in the country, you get used to being far from everything, but the distance works both ways. Nobody can hear you scream, sure, but you also can't hear someone watching you from the tree line. We took Vincent's truck down the old logging road that cut through his property, bouncing over ruts and exposed roots until we reached the clearing where he usually parked. The plan was simple: hike the perimeter, check each camera, swap out the SD cards, and be done before lunch. Vincent brought his retriever, Copper, a 7-year-old dog who knew these woods better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Our family's dog, Bailey, had vanished exactly 8 days earlier. She was a scruffy terrier mix, 11 years old, and she'd been sleeping on my bed since I was in 1st grade. My mom had walked every road within 5 miles, posted on every local Facebook group, even put up flyers at the gas station and the feed store. We'd resigned ourselves to thinking maybe a coyote got her, or she'd just wandered off to die somewhere quiet, the way old dogs sometimes do. Vincent knew how torn up I was about it. He didn't mention Bailey once that morning, which I appreciated. We made small talk about nothing as we started the first trail, Copper ranging ahead of us, nose down, tail wagging. The first 3 cameras were uneventful. Hundreds of photos of deer at dawn and dusk, a few raccoons, one blurry shot of what might have been a bobcat. Vincent seemed pleased. The fourth camera was mounted near an old hunting stand that nobody had used in years, a wooden platform about 12 feet up in an oak tree, accessible by boards nailed into the trunk as a makeshift ladder. When Vincent pulled the SD card and started scrolling through the photos on his phone, his face changed. Not dramatically, just this subtle shift where his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything at first, just kept swiping, faster and faster. Then he handed me the phone without a word. The first few images were normal, a doe and her fawn at dawn, their eyes glowing green in the camera flash. But then the photos shifted. A person, not walking past the camera like a hiker might, but standing there, facing it directly, like they knew exactly where it was. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. from 5 days ago. The figure wore dark clothes and had their hood pulled up, but what made my chest tighten was how still they stood, how deliberately they'd positioned themselves in frame. There were 7 photos in sequence, each taken 30 seconds apart, as the motion sensor kept triggering. In each one, the person was in a slightly different pose, moving closer to the camera, until the final image showed just their torso, the lens aimed at their chest. Like they were studying it, Vincent took the phone back and zoomed in on one of the shots. "That's not hunting gear," he muttered, "and nobody has permission to be out here." We both looked up at the hunting stand at the same time. It was one of those permanent structures built decades ago with weathered plywood and 2x4s, the kind that accumulates leaves and bird nests over the years. From where we stood, it looked abandoned like always, but Copper had stopped ranging. The dog sat at the base of the oak tree, staring straight up at the platform, a low whine building in his throat. Vincent called his name twice, but Copper wouldn't move, wouldn't look away. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The ladder boards, the ones nailed to the tree trunk, they weren't covered in the same layer of grime and moss as the rest. The wood was cleaner, worn smooth in places like someone had been climbing up and down regularly. Vincent saw it too. He pulled a flashlight from his pack even though it was broad daylight and aimed it up at the platform. We couldn't see much from below, just the underside of the plywood floor, but there was definitely something up there. Not leaves or debris, but shapes. Rectangular shapes that looked like they'd been arranged deliberately. My uncle's a big guy, former Marine, not easily rattled, but his hand was shaking enough that the flashlight beam bounced against the tree bark. He looked at me, then back up at the stand. "Stay here," he said, which we both knew I wasn't going to do. Vincent went up first, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. I stood at the base with Copper, who'd gone completely silent now, just staring upward with his ears pinned back. When Vincent's head cleared the platform, he stopped climbing. Just stopped, frozen on the ladder with his upper body visible above the floor level. The silence stretched out long enough that I called up to him, asking if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow, like someone had scooped something essential out of it. "Come up here," he said, "but go slow." I climbed up behind him, my hands gripping the boards that someone else had been gripping, maybe hours ago, maybe days. When I pulled myself onto the platform, the smell hit me first. Not rot exactly, but something organic and wrong, like turned earth mixed with mildew and something sharper I couldn't identify. The hunting stand was maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with low walls on 3 sides, and the fourth open to the tree. Someone had been living here, not camping, living. There was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner, the fabric still holding body warmth when Vincent touched it. A Coleman lantern, gallon jugs of water, 3 of them, partially full. Plastic bin with food wrappers, granola bar boxes, beef jerky packages. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the walls. Every square inch of the interior plywood was covered in photographs. Not random pictures, not magazine clippings. Photos of my family, of my house. There was my mom getting the mail, wearing the same blue cardigan she'd worn all week because the mornings had been chilly. There was my dad mowing the lawn, his bald spot catching the sun. There was me, walking to the end of our driveway to catch the school bus, my backpack slung over one shoulder. The photos were printed on regular computer paper, some in color, some in black and white, and they were taped up with such precision that they overlapped like shingles, creating this collage that covered every available surface. Vincent started tearing them down, and that's when I saw the dates written in the margins. The most recent one was from yesterday morning. The photo showed our back porch, taken from somewhere in the woods behind our house, and you could see straight through the kitchen window to where my mom stood at the sink. The angle was wrong, too high, like whoever took it had been in a tree. I felt something cold settle into my stomach. Not panic yet, but the beginning of it. That recognition that something terrible was happening and had been happening while we lived our normal lives completely unaware. Vincent had his phone out calling 911. His voice clipped and controlled as he gave our location to the dispatcher. I couldn't stop staring at the photos. There were dozens of them, maybe over 100. Some showed our cars in the driveway. Others captured my little sister playing in the yard with her jump rope. There was one of my dad loading groceries from his truck, and you could read the date on the newspaper tucked under his arm, July 9th. That was 12 days ago. Whoever this was had been documenting us for at least 2 weeks, probably longer. I started noticing other details. A notebook, spiral-bound, sitting on top of the sleeping bag. Vincent had already bagged it in a plastic grocery sack, not touching it directly, but through the clear plastic I could see handwriting on the visible page. Notes, times and dates. 1:15 p.m., father leaves for work. 3:30 p.m., mother returns from errands. 6:45 p.m., family dinner, all visible through kitchen window. Clinical observations like we were subjects in some study. My hands were trembling now, actually shaking, and I shoved them in my pockets because I didn't want Vincent to see how scared I was becoming. The dispatcher told Vincent to get off the property and wait for police at the main road. But as we started climbing down, Copper began barking, that deep aggressive bark he only used when something was seriously wrong. He'd moved about 20 feet from the tree and was digging frantically at the ground, dirt flying out behind him in sprays. Vincent yelled at him to stop, but Copper kept going, digging deeper, more frantic. Then he stopped abruptly and backed away, whimpering. We both walked over, even though every instinct told me not to. The hole Copper had dug was maybe a foot deep, and at the bottom, partially uncovered, was fabric. Blue fabric with white stars. I recognized it immediately. It was Bailey's collar, the decorative bandana my sister had tied around her neck the morning she disappeared. Vincent told me to get back to the truck, his voice sharp now, authority cutting through. But I couldn't move. He knelt down and carefully brushed away more dirt with his hand. And that's when we saw her, Bailey. Buried in a shallow grave right beneath the hunting stand. Her body was partially decomposed, but it was definitely her. That scruffy gray fur, the white patch on her chest. Someone had killed our dog and buried her here. The same person who'd been watching us. The same person who'd been sleeping 12 feet above her body. Vincent physically pulled me away from the grave and marched me back toward the truck, Copper following close behind. My mind was racing, trying to process everything at once and failing. Bailey didn't just wander off. Someone took her, killed her, and buried her here as what? A trophy? A warning? The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every shadow in the tree line suddenly suspect. Every bird call making me whip my head around. We reached the truck, and Vincent told me to get in and lock the doors. He stood outside with his rifle, which he'd grabbed from behind the seat, scanning the woods while we waited. The police took 18 minutes to arrive, which I know because I counted every single one of them on the truck's dashboard clock. When they finally showed up, there were 3 cars, 2 county sheriffs and a state trooper. Vincent walked them back to the hunting stand while I stayed at the truck with one of the deputies, a young guy named Collins who kept asking me questions I could barely answer because my brain felt wrapped in cotton. They processed the scene for hours. More police came, then detectives, then someone from what I assume was a crime scene unit. They took the photos, the notebook, the sleeping bag, everything. They brought dogs out to track scent trails, and that's when things got worse. The dogs led them on a path through the state forest that eventually came out on the dirt access road about a quarter-mile from the back of our property. And then the trail continued, through our backwoods, right up to the tree line behind our house. They found a spot where the underbrush had been flattened, branches arranged to create a natural blind with a clear view of our entire backyard and straight into our kitchen and living room windows. Whoever this person was, they hadn't just been living on Vincent's property. They'd been coming to our house regularly, watching us from maybe 40 yards away. The state trooper, an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, showed Vincent and me the spot. There were footprints in the soft ground, fresh ones from recent rain, size 11 boots, deep treads, probably hiking boots. The prints led right up to our back porch. They were on our porch. The most recent tracks were from this morning, based on how the dew had settled around them. My mom had been home alone all morning. My dad was at work, my sister at summer camp, and I'd been out with Vincent. The thought of this person standing on our porch, maybe looking through the window at my mom as she made coffee or read the newspaper, made me feel physically sick. The state trooper told us we couldn't go home yet, that they needed to secure the house and make sure nobody was inside. That possibility hadn't even occurred to me until she said it, and then it was all I could think about. They cleared the house room by room while we sat in Vincent's truck in our own driveway, watching armed officers move through our home with flashlights and drawn weapons, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. They didn't find anyone inside, but they found evidence someone had tried the back door. Scratches around the lock, fresh ones like someone had been testing it. The door had been locked, thank God, but only just barely. My mom always locked it, but sometimes she'd forget until right before bed, and apparently this person knew our routines well enough to know that. They took fingerprints from the door handle, from the hunting stand, from the water jugs. They put out an alert to surrounding counties and started going through recent reports of suspicious activity or prowlers. The detective in charge, a tired-looking man in his 50s who introduced himself as Lieutenant Owens, told us the stalking appeared to have been going on for at least 3 weeks, based on the photo timestamps, possibly longer. He said cases like this, when they escalate to killing a pet, often precede more serious violence. He didn't elaborate on what more serious meant, but he didn't have to. We couldn't stay in the house that night. The police arranged for a patrol car to park in our driveway, and we packed bags and stayed at my aunt's place in town. My sister cried when we told her about Bailey, and my mom just sat on the couch staring at nothing, processing the fact that someone had been watching us for weeks. My dad spent the entire evening on the phone with a security company, arranging for cameras and a monitoring system to be installed the next day. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos on the wall, that meticulous documentation of our lives, and wondered what this person had been planning to do next. They caught him 4 days later. A hiker called in a suspicious man matching the description near a trailhead about 15 miles away, and when police responded, he ran. They found him hiding in a drainage culvert with a backpack containing more photos, not just of my family but of 2 other families in the area. One was a couple who lived alone on a farm about 6 miles from us. The other was a single mother with 2 kids. He'd been watching all of us, rotating between properties, building these profiles like he was shopping. His name was Eugene Pritchard, 43 years old, with a history of stalking charges in 2 other states. He'd been living rough in the state forest for almost 2 months, moving between campsites, and had fixated on our family because, according to what the detective told us later, we seemed happy and unaware. That phrase stuck with me, happy and unaware. Like our normal life was what attracted him, made us targets. The fingerprints matched, the boot prints matched, and when they searched his campsite, they found a hunting knife with animal blood on it. Bailey's blood, the lab confirmed. He'd also been documenting entry points to our house in that notebook, which windows had locks that looked weak, what times the house was empty. The prosecutor told my parents he'd likely been in the planning stages of a home invasion. Pritchard pleaded guilty to stalking, animal cruelty, criminal trespass, and attempted burglary. He got 11 years, which seemed both like a lot and not nearly enough. We sold that house 6 months later. My parents couldn't stand living there anymore. Couldn't stop imagining him in those trees watching us every time they looked at the backyard. We moved to a subdivision in town where the houses are close together and there aren't any woods nearby. My sister needed therapy for a year afterward. Nightmares about someone watching her through her window. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm in unfamiliar places. That feeling of being observed without knowing it, of someone learning your patterns, your routines, the rhythm of your life. The hunting stand is gone now. Vincent tore it down himself the week after they arrested Pritchard, burned every piece of wood. But I've never been able to go back to those woods, even though they're family property. Some places get ruined by what happens in them, and that 40 acres will always be where I learned that privacy is an illusion, and that monsters don't need to be supernatural to be real. They just need patience, a camera, and the knowledge that most people never look twice at the tree line behind their house. Growing up on my family's farm in a quiet stretch of northern countryside shaped most of my routines, and that year wasn't any different. While my dad was stuck in town recovering from a back injury, I took over the harvest work alone, juggling long days between the fields, the grain shed, and the old workshop behind the house. My name's Lacey, and at the time I was trying to keep everything running on a tight schedule, waking up before sunrise and ending the days covered in dust and sweat. The farm sat a few miles from the nearest cluster of houses, surrounded by cornfields that seemed endless when the wind got going. Most days were uneventful, predictable even, which made what happened stand out even more in my memory. The first strange thing started with the fuel. I kept noticing the levels dipping lower than they should have, even on days when I barely touched the tractor or the generator. I chalked it up to miscalculations at first. Maybe I'd left a gauge half stuck, or maybe I'd filled something halfway and forgotten. But after the third or fourth time, I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just me being careless. I remember staring at the big diesel barrel by the shed late one afternoon, the sun sinking behind the trees and giving everything a kind of orange haze, and thinking the numbers weren't adding up no matter how much I tried to justify it. It bothered me enough that I started double-checking locks and writing down amounts in a small notebook I kept in my back pocket. One evening, after a long stretch of work left me too wired to sleep, I caught myself walking around with a flashlight, scanning the edges of the property like I expected something to step out. Nothing did, just the rustling of tall corn stalks shifting in the wind and the occasional creak of the barn settling for the night. But as I stood there listening, I got this weird sense of being observed, like there was attention on me from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. Not fear exactly, more like a slow awareness creeping in that the fuel issue might not be random. I hated how my mind kept circling back to that thought even when I tried to push it away. The next morning I decided to put up a small hidden camera. It wasn't anything high-tech, just a compact motion-activated one I'd used once to keep raccoons out of the feed bins. But I tucked it into a gap between boards on the side of the shed, where it had a clear view of the fuel area. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my dad on the phone, because I didn't want him worrying or driving out before he was healed. For 2 days, the camera caught nothing but shadows and moths drifting past the lens. Then, on the third night, when I sat down after dinner and checked the footage on my laptop, I felt my chest tighten in a way I'd never experienced before. 3 men, 3 different men, walked straight into the camera's view, all wearing dark jackets, moving like they knew exactly where they were going, and exactly when no one would see them. Seeing those men on the screen felt unreal at first, like I'd stumbled into footage from someplace else by mistake. They didn't look lost or curious. They moved with this quiet confidence, checking the fuel barrel, glancing toward the house, and then walking back toward the cornfield in a single file line. One of them, tall, broad shoulders, a messy beard, paused a little longer than the others, turning his head just enough that I saw the reflection of the camera's faint infrared glow in his eyes. He didn't step closer or do anything dramatic, but the way he kept still for those few seconds made my pulse thud in my ears. It wasn't a look of surprise. It was like he was waiting. I replayed that clip over and over, each time hoping I'd misread something, but every detail pointed to the same conclusion. They'd been coming onto the property long before I noticed the fuel issue. The timestamps showed them slipping in roughly the same time each night, always from the far edge of the field where the corn grew thickest. Nothing about their movements looked rushed. They weren't trying to grab supplies and bolt. They were studying the place. Studying me, honestly. I sat there at the kitchen table with the laptop open, listening to the old refrigerator buzz, and tried to steady my breathing enough to think straight. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but the nearest neighbor lived too far down the road, and the spotty cell service around the property made calls drop unless I stood near the kitchen window. Part of me didn't want to risk stepping outside at all. I knew I couldn't stay there alone, not after seeing their faces so clearly, so I grabbed my keys and decided I'd drive into town to the small sheriff's outpost near the feed store. The sky outside had already gone dark, and the wind carried that sharp, dry smell that comes just before a storm. I remember walking toward the truck, feeling small under the wide-open night, telling myself over and over that once I reached the main road, I'd be fine. But the moment I pressed the brake pedal, it sank straight to the floor with no resistance. I tried again, slower this time, and the result didn't change. A cold rush of realization crawled through me as I popped the hood and saw the line dangling like a snapped vein. Someone had cut it cleanly, leaving no question about their intentions. Before I could even process what that meant, I caught a cluster of lights flicker between the rows of corn, small beams weaving toward me, growing brighter with every second. 3 of them. They moved with the same slow certainty I'd seen on the camera footage, like they weren't in any hurry because they already knew exactly where I was. Instinct kicked in harder than logic at that point, and I sprinted back toward the house without even checking if they'd seen me. The ground felt uneven under my boots, every step slamming into the dirt louder than I wanted, but the only thing in my mind was getting behind a locked door. Once inside, I bolted the front entrance, dragged a chair against it, and snapped off every light I could reach. The house sank into this heavy kind of darkness where every noise suddenly had weight. The ticking of the hallway clock, the faint hum of wiring in the walls, even the shifting of wood as the temperature dipped. I crouched near the window but kept low enough that no one outside could spot me. From that angle, I could see beams of light drifting along the edge of the field, like they were feeling their way closer. I grabbed the old cordless phone I kept for emergencies, hoping the landline would carry a signal even if my cell couldn't. When the dial tone actually came through, relief punched through me so fast I had to steady myself against the counter. I called the sheriff's outpost, stumbling through the details. Fuel theft, trespassers, brake line cut, lights approaching the house. The dispatcher didn't waste time with questions. She told me to stay inside, stay quiet, and that a unit was already on its way from town. I wanted to believe that help was close, but the minutes stretched out painfully long. Every so often, the men's flashlights swung across the yard, pausing near the truck, then sweeping toward the barn, then drifting back to the field like they were circling, narrowing down where I must have gone. At some point, the lights disappeared entirely, which somehow made things even worse. I sat there in the dim glow of the kitchen nightlight, listening so hard that my ears almost buzzed. A strange stillness settled over the property, thick enough that even the crickets had quieted down. I kept picturing those men standing motionless between the corn rows, waiting for the perfect moment to approach the house again. When headlights finally broke through the trees at the end of the long driveway, I didn't move at first. I thought it was another trick, another way to draw me out. But the flash of blue and white that followed made my shoulders finally loosen. 2 deputies stepped out, announced themselves, and swept the property with spotlights while I stayed inside as instructed. What sticks with me even now is how little they found. No footprints in the dirt near the house, no cut path in the corn where I'd seen the flashlights weaving. The only evidence left behind was the severed brake line and a few partial impressions near the fuel barrel that didn't match any boots I owned. The deputies told me they'd patrol the area for the next few nights, suggested I stay with a relative in town until things calmed down, and promised to check the fields again in daylight. I followed their advice and didn't return until nearly a week later. Nothing else ever happened after that. No more missing fuel, no strange lights, no signs of those men anywhere. Sometimes I wonder if they realized I'd seen them and backed off, or if something interrupted whatever they'd been planning. I still don't have answers, but every harvest season since then, I make sure to keep the doors locked, the cameras running, and a working truck parked by the road just in case. I'd been spending most of my days helping my parents manage the farmland that had been in our family for as long as anyone could remember. A place where routines were predictable enough for the seasons themselves to feel like neighbors. That afternoon started quietly, the kind of quiet where you can hear the grain bins creak when the wind shifts. I remember sorting through storage boxes in the shed, still dusty from generations of use, when a white truck I didn't recognize turned onto our long driveway. The tires kicked up a thin trail of pale dirt, and even before the engine shut off, I caught myself wondering why anyone from the county would show up without calling first. My brother Evan stepped out from the barn with a puzzled look, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. I wasn't expecting company, neither was he, and both of us kept waiting for some familiar signal that never came. A man in a navy jacket with a laminated badge hanging from a flimsy clip stepped out of the truck, moving like someone who already knew where he was headed. There was something rehearsed about the way he held a clipboard against his side, like the papers weren't actually for writing but for acting the part. He said he was a county well inspector, speaking in this oddly clipped rhythm that made his words land too fast, as if he were racing through memorized lines. He didn't introduce himself by name, didn't shake hands, just pointed toward the back acreage and said he needed to check the water access points. Evan offered to walk with him, but the man refused instantly, too instantly, insisting he worked more efficiently alone. It wasn't anger, just a sharpness that made both of us step back out of instinct. He walked our property like someone moving through a mental checklist, pausing at strange spots that didn't have anything to do with wells or water lines. At one point, I saw him standing perfectly still beside the old sycamore behind the house, head tilted slightly, like he was studying the upstairs windows instead of anything on the ground. Every time I thought about approaching him, he drifted off again, disappearing behind sheds or toward the tree line. The whole time, his truck door remained open, the keys still dangling in the ignition as though he knew no one would dare touch it. My parents stayed inside, watching from the kitchen window, uncertain if they should step out or leave us to handle it. The longer he wandered, the more I felt this creeping sense that he wasn't inspecting anything. He was observing. When he finally came back around the house, his boots had a thin, powdery smear on the toes, like he'd walked through chalk dust or crushed stone from somewhere too far off our usual paths. He told us everything was up to standard, and that he'd file the paperwork later in the week. Then he left without waiting for a response, pulling out of the driveway slowly, almost lingering as if he expected us to follow. As soon as the truck disappeared down the road, Evan muttered that something didn't add up. My parents stepped outside, confusion written all over their faces, and we all agreed to walk the property ourselves. None of us could shake the faint tension he'd left behind, like a room where someone had just been whispering. When we rounded the back corner of the house, the first thing we noticed was the strange white smear on our siding, something none of us remembered being there before. Evan was the first to spot the marks on the trees. They weren't random scuffs from equipment or scratches from deer. These were deliberate strokes, short vertical lines made with something pale enough to stand out even in the shade. 3 marks faced the upstairs windows where our bedrooms were, all aligned toward the house like silent arrows. Each line had a slightly different pressure, as if someone tested how much chalk they could use before it crumbled. My mom kept asking if any of us had done it, maybe for some project or survey work, but she sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than us. My dad crouched near one of the trees and rubbed the residue between his fingers. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave me said enough. This didn't belong to anything we'd ever done on the property. We decided to check the rest of the yard, following a half-circle pattern the inspector must have taken, judging by his footprints and the way the dirt had been disturbed. Evan went into the shed to grab the small ladder we used to fix gutters, but he stopped halfway through the doorway. He called us over, pointing to the corner shelf where a stack of old metal pails had been knocked over. None of us had touched them in weeks. The air inside was still, heavy with the smell of old hay and machine oil, but there was this faint trace of something else, like the metallic scent left after someone handled tools with damp hands. We found a small scrap of paper near the back wall, a corner torn from a form or pamphlet. No writing, just a faint indentation, as though something had been pressed hard against it. Inside the house, things felt even worse. My mom noticed the front curtains had been moved slightly, as if someone had pinched the fabric to peek inside. The living room rug had a shallow arc pressed into it, not from our boots, but from someone standing very still in one spot. We checked the hallway next, and that's when Evan pointed out the framed school photos on the wall. They were crooked, but not randomly. Each one was angled just enough that the glare from the overhead light hit the glass in a way that made the hallway viewable from outside through the front window, as if someone wanted to see deeper inside without stepping too close. My dad dropped his voice and said we should call the county office before we touched anything else, just to make sure someone actually sent that man. When my dad got through to the county office, his expression tightened with each passing second. He didn't repeat the whole explanation out loud, just asked simple questions. Was anyone scheduled to inspect rural wells today? Did they have trucks assigned to our region? Did they employ anyone fitting the description we gave? Then came the part that made my mom sit down at the kitchen table without even pulling out a chair. The county had no idea what he was talking about. There were no active inspections, no employees sent to our area, and no record of a white truck making rounds on farmland. The woman on the phone sounded genuinely confused, even concerned, and asked if my dad wanted her to file an unofficial safety note with the sheriff's office. My dad said yes, but the moment he hung up, none of us felt any safer. Something had happened here that we hadn't fully pieced together yet. Later that evening, Evan remembered something that made all of us gather in the mudroom. He'd noticed the inspector lingering near the side entrance earlier, the one we rarely used unless we were hauling feed. When we opened the door, the outside mat had been shifted just enough to expose the edge of the concrete beneath it. There, pressed into the slab, were faint outlines, shoe prints that weren't ours. They had a narrow shape, with a small chip missing near the right heel. Whoever wore those boots had stood there for long enough to grind the dust into the cracks. Just a few feet away, stuck between the siding panels, we found a tiny metal clip, the kind used to fasten ID badges. It wasn't from any county-issued gear we'd ever seen. My mom held it delicately, like it might burn her fingers, and none of us said a word. We all felt the same unspoken truth forming. As it got darker, my dad suggested we check the trail camera set up along the north field near the creek line. We usually used it to track coyotes, but it had a wide enough range that someone passing through might have triggered it. Evan and I walked out there with flashlights, the beam slicing through the rows of corn that rustled like fabric in the breeze. When we finally pulled the SD card and took it inside to view on my laptop, the first few images were normal. Foxes, a neighbor's stray dog, shadows shifting as clouds moved overhead. Then we reached a photo stamped earlier that afternoon. It showed the inspector, but not how we expected. He wasn't examining anything. He was facing the camera directly, standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the lens like he knew exactly where it was and wanted to be seen. His jacket was open slightly, revealing a small black device clipped inside, almost like a recorder. My mom called one of the neighboring families we were close to, just to warn them. As she explained what happened, her voice tightened when the other woman interrupted her. 3 farms nearby had been hit by home invasions recently, all within the past few months. The intruders left behind chalk marks on trees, always facing bedroom windows, along with signs that someone had studied the homeowner's routines. Those families mentioned seeing an unfamiliar truck in the days leading up to their break-ins, sometimes parked on the road, sometimes pulling in briefly under some excuse before driving off again. Hearing those words made every piece click into place in a way that turned the air heavy around us. The inspector hadn't been gathering information for a report. He'd been preparing something else entirely. None of us slept in our rooms that night. My dad stayed awake with the shotgun he usually kept stored away, while Evan and I rotated between windows, watching for headlights or movement around the tree line. But nothing happened. Days passed, and still nothing. The marks eventually washed away in the rain, but the feeling that someone had mapped our home stayed with us. Weeks later, the sheriff's office called to say they'd found a truck, matching the description abandoned outside another rural property. Not ours, but no suspect was inside. They advised us to install cameras, keep gates locked, and report anything unusual. We followed every suggestion. Whatever was supposed to happen at our place never did, but none of us believed the man simply changed his mind. Something interrupted his plan, something we'll probably never know. And even now, whenever I see a white truck slowing near the road, a part of me still waits for a stranger in a navy jacket to step out and pretend he's there to help.
That night was absolute chaos. The storm had started in the middle of the afternoon, and the sound of the wind mixed with the rain hitting the windows made me feel like I was trapped inside a drum. I'd taken the day to catch up on some chores I'd been putting off for weeks, so I figured that would be my company as I folded laundry and swept the floors. I've been living alone in this quiet, out-of-the-way neighborhood for a while now, and it's rare to get visitors, especially on nights like that. So when I heard the knock on the door, I felt this strange shiver crawl up my spine, but I tried to brush it off, probably just a neighbor needing something. I opened the door, and there he was, soaked from head to toe, hair dripping water, his heavy jacket clinging to his body. He looked like he was in his 40s, his face partially hidden by the hood's shadows, but I could see he was shivering. He said his car broke down nearby and that he needed to use the phone. Something about his story felt off. There wasn't really a road close by. But who was I to judge, right? I forced a small smile and nodded, letting him in quickly so I could get this over with. I turned to grab the phone from the table in the living room, and that's when I heard the click of the door lock behind me. In that instant, my senses kicked into overdrive like a blaring alarm. For a second, I was frozen with my hand in midair, trying to process what just happened. There was no reason for him to lock the door, and the way he did it, so quietly and deliberately, made it clear this wasn't some innocent gesture. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and not show any fear. I turned slowly, trying to stay calm, and saw him standing there in the middle of the room, watching me with an unreadable expression. He didn't look uncomfortable anymore. In fact, he looked almost amused, which only made it all creepier. He looked me up and down, like he was sizing me up, and asked where the phone was. I pointed to the table, trying to avoid eye contact. My mind was racing, scrambling for an excuse, anything that would convince him to leave without him catching on to the fear on my face. But he didn't even make a move towards the table or the phone. Instead, he started walking around the room, his footsteps echoing on the wood floor, each one slower than the last, like he was examining his surroundings. I followed his movements from the corner of my eye, my hands starting to sweat, and it was then that I realized we were in some kind of silent standoff. As he wandered around, I started planning an escape in my head. My mind was working overtime, trying to calculate any possible exit without him realizing what I was up to. The door was locked, and he was between me and any easy way out. I glanced at the windows. They were locked too, with thick glass that would take way too long to open. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the storm outside, which seemed to have picked up like the world was closing off any chance for help. He, on the other hand, didn't seem rushed at all. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying my barely contained fear. Gradually, he started talking, telling a story completely different from what he said at the door. His tone was calm, almost casual, but every word sounded like a thinly veiled threat. He said he was just visiting town and that he had noticed the isolated and perfect house earlier in the day. I felt exposed, like my own home wasn't safe anymore. My stomach turned, and every part of me was screaming to get out, but I knew I had to act carefully. Each second felt like an eternity, and every word he spoke was a reminder of how trapped I was, completely vulnerable in my own living room. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked again if he wanted to use the phone, hoping that maybe, somehow, he'd change his mind and leave. He just gave me this cold, lifeless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No rush," he replied, shrugging like he was on a casual visit. By now, I couldn't hide my fear. I felt my hands shaking as I took a few steps back, trying to create some distance. But he noticed, and like it was a game, took a few steps toward me, closing the gap I was so desperately trying to keep. It turned into a sort of sinister dance, where every move I made was mirrored by him, like a silent predator enjoying my growing panic. My only chance was the hallway that led to the bedrooms, but I'd have to be quick enough that he wouldn't catch on. With my heart racing, I threw out, "I'll grab you a towel," using the first excuse that came to mind. He tilted his head, studying me like he was deciding if he should laugh at my poor attempt. But to my surprise, he just nodded, that unsettling smile still on his face. I took the chance and started walking toward the hallway, feeling his gaze burning into my back with every step. As soon as I turned down the hall, my pace quickened, and my only thought was to find somewhere safe to lock myself in until he left. I darted into the master bedroom, shut the door behind me, and turned the key with trembling hands. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the storm outside anymore. All my confidence crumbled as I realized just how trapped I was. I looked around, searching for anything I could use to defend myself, a chair, a lamp, anything. But nothing felt enough against someone who had clearly planned every step of what he was doing. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway. He was coming, unhurried, like he was savoring every second. I tried to steady my breathing, crouched behind the bed, clutching my phone and desperately trying to call for help. But, as if things couldn't get worse, I realized I had no signal. The storm must have knocked it out. A chill ran down my spine, and in that moment, all I could do was stay perfectly still, listening as his footsteps grew closer and closer to the door. The footsteps stopped right outside, and the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than any sound. I stayed there, frozen, barely breathing, waiting for any clue of his next move. After a few seconds that felt like hours, I heard the handle turn slowly. I could only hope the door was really locked, but when the handle stopped, he started knocking. Slow, rhythmic, almost mocking. Each knock felt like a reminder that I wasn't safe, that he was just outside, waiting for his chance. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst, trying to convince myself that if I stayed quiet enough, maybe he'd give up. To my surprise, after a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited a bit longer, afraid it might be a trick, but the silence continued. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up and, with shaky legs, crept over to the window to see if he was gone. There was no one in the yard, and with a mix of relief and suspicion, I unlocked the bedroom door and dashed to the living room. The front door was slightly open, and the rain was still pouring outside. He was gone, no sign of him or any trace that he'd been there. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but since that night, I lock my door as soon as it gets dark. It's just a habit now, a reminder that, as safe as a home can feel, danger can show up anytime, usually without any warning at all. Working the graveyard shift at a gas station was never really my dream job, but honestly, it was easy work that paid the bills. Most nights were spent sneaking in quick naps and gulping down coffee, with only the occasional interruption from a drunk needing more beer or a lost driver looking for directions. But a few months ago, a customer started showing up almost every night, always around the same time, between 3 and 4 in the morning. The guy was thin, in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and sunken eyes, always dressed in worn-out baggy clothes. At first, I didn't think much of him, just another oddball wandering around late at night. But soon, I started noticing something that made me uncomfortable. Every time he came, he bought items that wouldn't seem suspicious on their own, but together, they felt way out of the ordinary. One night, he bought a roll of duct tape. The next, industrial-sized trash bags. Then, rope. I'd try to make small talk, ask things like, working on a project? Or going camping? He'd always respond with a quick nod, never meeting my eyes, like he was in a hurry or wanted to avoid any interaction. It started to really bug me, you know. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time he left, I'd feel this strange, lingering unease, like something was deeply wrong with the whole situation. One night, he came in looking different, more tense. His hands were shaking slightly, and he seemed a bit out of it, like he was in a rush but didn't quite know why he was there. He went straight to the tools section and grabbed one of those heavy-duty flashlights, the kind that can light up a whole mile if needed. When he came to the counter, I tried to make small talk again, asking something like, "What's the flashlight for? Late night fishing?" He just mumbled something I couldn't make out, didn't even look at me, and threw some crumpled bills on the counter, almost like he was desperate to get out of there. The way he acted left a knot in my stomach, a bad feeling I couldn't shake. As soon as he left, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I knew it was probably none of my business, but I just couldn't ignore the sense that he was up to something strange. I grabbed my phone, and after hesitating a bit, decided to call the police station down the street. I quickly explained the situation, not going into too much detail, but enough for the officer on the line to take me seriously. He promised to send a patrol car to check things out in the area. I felt a bit guilty afterward, wondering if I was overreacting, but at the same time, something inside me said I'd done the right thing. It didn't take long for a patrol car to pull up nearby. I watched the two officers exchange a few quick words before heading off down the road in the direction the man had taken. I watched from the window, still feeling that nagging sense that something terrible was about to be uncovered. A few minutes later, one of the officers came back into the store, looking both surprised and disturbed. He told me they'd found the man's car parked in a secluded spot near an old trail that led into a dense wooded area. The car was a mess. He'd practically turned it into some kind of home. Inside the car, they found a bunch of the items he'd been buying from the gas station over the past few weeks: rope, garbage bags, duct tape. But what really sent chills down my spine was hearing about a grimy old mattress on the back seat, covered with torn blankets and food scraps scattered everywhere. The officer said it looked like he'd been living there for a while, but what nobody could understand was why. He wasn't just a regular homeless guy, they said. Apparently, he had money, but was choosing to live this way, accumulating these strange supplies. The officers tried talking to him, but he stayed vague, not offering much explanation. He only kept saying he was doing important work and that people wouldn't understand. That just made the whole thing even stranger. The officers tried to dig deeper, to see if he was involved in any crimes or had a history of mental health issues, but they didn't find anything relevant. No criminal record, no medical history indicating any problems. The best they could do was make him leave the area, telling him he couldn't stay there since it was private property. After he left, things cooled down a bit, and I tried to get back to my usual routine, but that uncomfortable feeling never really left me. Every late-night customer that came in after that, I'd look twice, half expecting to see him again. Time passed, and I started to think I'd never see the guy again. But a few weeks later, around the same time, close to 3 in the morning, he came back. This time, he looked even more worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. He walked in, took a quick look around, like he was searching for someone, and headed straight for the counter, buying only one thing, an extra battery for that flashlight he'd bought last time. When he got to the counter, I couldn't hold back my curiosity this time, so I asked more directly, trying to understand what was going on. "Are you working on some night job or something, man?" He stared at me for a moment, but his eyes looked empty, distant, like he was in another world. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, "It's safer at night. Nobody sees me." That sent chills down my spine. He paid for the battery without another word and rushed out, like he was running from something or someone. I watched him leave until he disappeared into the dark road, more convinced than ever that he was up to something very strange. After that night, I never saw him again. A few days later, one of the officers stopped by on his patrol, and I found out they'd found his car abandoned in the same spot. But the man himself seemed to have vanished without a trace. There were no signs of violence or anything to suggest he'd planned to leave. Just his car, covered in dust, with all the items he'd accumulated still inside, untouched. Since then, every time I think back to those nights, I'm left with this bitter feeling that something truly sinister was happening right under my nose. Maybe I'll never know what was really going on with him, but one thing's for sure. The image of that man and his hollow, empty stare still haunts me to this day. It happened on one of those weekends I'd been looking forward to for weeks. My parents were going away, and I'd finally have the whole house to myself. I was around 17, and like any teenager, all I wanted was a little independence and, of course, to enjoy the silence. Back then, I loved spending hours in the basement. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only place where I really felt isolated from the rest of the world. I grabbed some blankets, went down with a few snacks, and started watching a movie on my laptop, just relaxing, enjoying the near-perfect silence. That was the plan, at least. Until I started hearing some weird noises upstairs. At first, I thought it was all in my head. You know when you hear a noise and try to convince yourself it's just the house settling or something like that? Yeah, I tried to calm myself that way, but the sounds continued. It was like footsteps, soft, like someone was trying to walk without making a sound. I just sat there, frozen, listening intently. I even thought about ignoring it, but the discomfort was growing. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, trying to laugh it off, but he noticed something off in my voice. He chuckled and told me it was probably just the wind or something, and to relax. That helped a bit, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. After that call, I forced myself to try and relax again. I started the movie back up, turned the volume up a bit to distract myself, but the idea of being alone in the whole house started to make me uneasy. I tried not to think too much about it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Then, late that night, just as the movie was ending, I heard the noise again. This time, it wasn't just a single footstep. There were several. I could swear someone was walking around upstairs. And then came the sound that made my heart race, the slow creak of a door closing. I mentally ran through the doors upstairs and knew that the only one that made that specific sound was the door to my bedroom. I was completely frozen. I tried to think, to convince myself it was impossible, but something in me knew this wasn't a mistake. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone again and dialed 911. The operator listened calmly, but my voice must have given away how scared I was. She asked me to stay where I was and said she'd send a squad car as soon as possible. The next few minutes felt like hours. I just stood there, still, with the phone in my hand, listening to every little noise, wondering if I'd see someone coming down the basement stairs any second. The sense of helplessness was terrifying. When I finally heard the police sirens approaching, it was like I could breathe again. The officers entered the house and went straight upstairs while I waited in the basement, still too afraid to move. After a while, one of the officers came down and told me the house seemed empty, but they wanted to ask me a few questions. I told them about the footsteps and the sound of the door closing, and they seemed to take it seriously. I asked one of them to check every room and only went upstairs when they assured me it was safe. It felt like an overreaction, but I didn't want to take any chances. As they inspected the house, I heard one of the officers call out to the others. My heart started racing again. When they came back, they called me over and said they'd found something strange. A small, nearly invisible entryway hidden behind a built-in closet in the upstairs hallway. When they opened the little door, the smell of mold and dust was strong, and inside there were signs that someone had been staying there recently. A folded blanket, some food wrappers, and even a few water bottles. The thought that someone had been living hidden in my house while I was there alone sent chills down my spine that I'll never forget. The police started asking more questions, like if I'd noticed any objects out of place or anything strange in the previous days. Honestly, I hadn't noticed anything unusual, but thinking back, a few small details started to make sense. Little things, like a glass out of place in the kitchen, or that strange feeling that someone was watching me, which I'd always ignored, thinking it was just in my head. Everything made more sense now, and I felt a mix of fear and disgust just thinking that I'd been sharing my house with someone without even knowing. The officers told me that, unfortunately, they couldn't find any recent traces of whoever it was. Apparently, this person had slipped out as soon as they realized I'd called the police. They said they'd keep searching in the area, but for now, I was safe. Even with that reassurance, I couldn't feel at ease. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, every little sound making my heart race. My parents came home the next day, and when I told them what happened, I saw the shock and worry on their faces. From that day on, the house never felt the same to me. To this day, I remember that experience like it happened yesterday. We never found out who the person was, where they came from, or how long they'd been hiding there. After that weekend, my parents reinforced all the doors and windows and even installed security cameras. But the feeling of invasion stayed with me. Every time I'm alone at home now, I still get that shiver down my spine, like someone's watching me. Even though the police assured me I was safe, that experience left a mark that's never really faded. Now, whenever I hear a strange noise, my mind goes right back to that night and the slow sound of the door closing upstairs. If I learned anything from this, never underestimate the silence of an empty house. I've never been the type to get scared easily, especially in public places like a grocery store. I was used to shopping late at night since it was the only time I had free after a full day at work. Back then, I worked as an office assistant, and by the time I was out, all I wanted was some peace and quiet to get what I needed and head home. The 24-hour grocery store in my town was always quiet at night, with empty aisles and only a few staff around. It was the perfect setting to unwind a little. But that night, something strange gave me an unsettling feeling that I couldn't ignore. I was grabbing a few common items, not paying much attention, until I noticed a man standing in the opposite aisle, staring straight at the shelf, yet it felt like he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. It was like he was pretending to be a shopper, handling products with this awkward stance as if he didn't know what he was doing. I thought I was just being paranoid and kept walking, but every time I changed aisles, there he was again, just a few feet away. He was pretending to look at the products, but he didn't touch anything. That's when I realized that no matter which aisle I entered, he always appeared there, as if playing some kind of strange game. I tried to convince myself that he was just there by coincidence, but each aisle I entered, he would show up right behind, always keeping that minimal distance as if trying not to attract much attention. My heart began to race in a way I couldn't control. I grabbed a bag of cookies and pretended to be distracted, trying to observe his movements out of the corner of my eye. He was looking at the shelf, but I could tell his eyes were slightly angled toward me. That blank, almost robotic expression sent a chill down my spine. It was way too late for someone to be wandering aimlessly. Anyone there at that hour was usually in a hurry to finish their shopping, but he seemed to be there just to watch me. I decided it was best not to take any chances. I tossed a few things into my cart just to keep up appearances, pretending everything was normal, while every instinct I had screamed for me to leave. I went over to the self-checkout, and as I scanned my items, I looked discreetly over my shoulder. He was standing near the exit, almost like he was waiting for me, but trying to look casual, staring at a display board on the wall. My hands were shaking as I scanned the items and completed the purchase. I didn't know what he wanted, but the idea of going out to the parking lot alone and finding him there was terrifying. As soon as I was done, I took a deep breath, tried to calm myself, and prepared for whatever might happen. When I stepped out of the store, the cold night air wrapped around me, intensifying the tension in my body. The parking lot was practically empty, just a few scattered cars, and mine was parked a little further away in one of the last spots. I quickly looked around, and there he was, standing by a pillar near the exit, staring at me with that eerie, unwavering look. He wasn't even trying to hide it this time. It was as if he no longer cared if I knew he was following me. That's when I felt my stomach twist. Part of me just wanted to sprint to the car and get out of there as fast as I could, but I knew I had to keep calm. With steady steps, but without running, I headed toward my car, trying to look as composed as possible. With each step, I felt his gaze burning into my back. That's when I realized something even more disturbing. He started following me again, this time with no disguise. The sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot made my heart race, but I forced myself not to look back. I was only a few feet from my car, and I knew I had to act quickly. As I got closer, I reached into my bag for the key with trembling hands, praying he'd give up and leave, but he just kept getting closer. When I finally got my key out, panic fully took over. I put the key in the lock and unlocked the car, almost tripping as I opened the driver's side door. At that moment, I glanced back and saw that he had stopped just a few feet from me, with a blank expression, almost as if he was waiting for some kind of reaction. There was something in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and hunger. I don't know, but it was enough to make me jump inside the car and lock all the doors immediately. I stuck the key in the ignition in a hurry, my heart pounding so hard I could hear each beat. The engine took what felt like forever to start, but as soon as it did, I didn't think twice. I reversed and sped out, almost hitting a column. I took one last look in the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the same spot, watching me as I drove away. He didn't try to chase the car, didn't make a single move. He just stood there, watching, like he knew something I didn't. As soon as I hit the road, I took a deep breath, but the feeling of relief didn't last. Out of reflex, I looked in the rearview mirror again, still scared, and that's when I saw a shadow, almost as if he was there, in the darkness of the back seat, even though I knew that was impossible. My heart nearly stopped. I jumped in my seat and turned to look at the back, just to be sure he wasn't actually there. Of course, there was no one, but the fear was so deep in me that for a second, I believed he could have somehow gotten into the car without me noticing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the feeling of still being watched was overwhelming. At that moment, all I wanted was to get home as fast as possible and put it all behind me. I sped down the empty road, avoiding looking at the sides, while my mind raced with thoughts about what he might have done if I hadn't managed to escape. Getting home, however, didn't bring the relief I'd hoped for. When I parked in my driveway and turned off the car, I realized my hands were still shaking. I took a few deep breaths, but it felt like the sense of danger had seeped into every fiber of my body. I looked around before getting out of the car, half expecting to see him lurking in some dark corner of the street, but everything was empty. Only then did I step out and rush inside, locking the door behind me. Even in my own home, I felt exposed, like he could be watching me from some hidden place I couldn't see. That night, I left all the lights on and slept with my phone by my side, every little sound making me jump out of bed. After that night, I thought the feeling of being watched would eventually fade, but in the days that followed, the discomfort only grew. Every time I left the house, it felt like someone was watching, and even at work, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. I told a few people about what happened, but they all said I was probably just being paranoid, that I was probably just too tired and got spooked over nothing. But deep down, I knew it had been real. So one night I decided to go back to the store, just to make sure it was nothing but a nightmare in my mind. And that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw the same man from that night standing by the store entrance, exactly where I first saw him. He didn't move, didn't look at me, but he was there, like a shadow that refused to leave. I didn't need any more confirmation that it wasn't a coincidence. I turned back to my car without even stepping foot inside the store, and since then, I've completely changed my routine. I started shopping at different times, at other places, avoiding any situation where I might be alone. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or why he followed me, but the memory of that blank expression and that cold stare haunts me to this day. Whoever or whatever he was, I hope I never cross paths with him again.
Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Michigan gets cold fast, and that night the temperature had dropped to near freezing by the time we reached the old Brennan Motors factory. I was 22, stuck in my hometown after college, working at a hardware store and watching my engineering degree collect dust. Every abandoned building in our dying industrial town had a story, but Brennan's was different. 15 years empty, completely untouched, like time had just stopped the day they shut it down. My friends and I had been talking about exploring it for months, and that Friday night, fueled by boredom and cheap whiskey, we finally decided to do it. There were 4 of us: Jake from the body shop, Melissa who was visiting from nursing school, and her boyfriend Connor, who thought watching Urbex videos on YouTube made him an expert on abandoned places. We knew it was stupid, we knew it was illegal, but when you're young and desperate for any kind of excitement in a town where nothing ever happens, you make stupid choices. The factory sat on 40 acres of cracked concrete and overgrown weeds, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut open so many times, it barely served a purpose anymore. We'd parked Jake's truck at a strip mall half a mile away and walked along the abandoned railroad tracks that curved behind the property. Connor had printed out satellite images and drawn a route with a red marker, through the fence near the loading docks, then into the main assembly building through a door he'd seen in someone's Instagram post from 2 years ago. The moon was almost full that night, casting everything in this silvery light that made the broken windows look like black teeth. As we squeezed through a gap in the fence, I remember noticing how quiet it was. No cars, no animals, not even wind. Just our footsteps crunching on broken glass and gravel. The loading dock doors were exactly where Connor said they'd be, one of them hanging off its track at an angle that left just enough space for us to slip inside. Inside, our flashlights cut through the darkness to reveal exactly what Connor had promised. A massive production floor frozen in 2008. Half-assembled car frames sat on conveyor tracks, their metal bones covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. Tools lay scattered on workbenches like the workers had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. The air tasted metallic and stale, with this underlying smell of rust and decay that made Melissa pull her shirt up over her nose. Jake kept whistling low, running his hands along the equipment and muttering about how much some of this stuff would be worth if we could haul it out. But what struck me most was the sound. Every footstep echoed 3 or 4 times, bouncing off the high ceiling and coming back distorted. Connor was already heading toward a metal staircase that led up to the catwalks, his phone out, recording everything for his Instagram. The catwalks were where things started to go wrong. They ran 30 feet above the production floor, a maze of metal walkways that connected different sections of the factory. The railings were chest-high and sturdy enough, but the floor panels were a different story. Some were solid steel grating that clanged under our feet. Others were completely missing, leaving gaps you had to jump across. Worse, in the darkness, you couldn't always tell which was which until your flashlight caught the edge of a hole. Connor led the way, moving fast and confident like he'd done this 100 times before. Jake followed, then Melissa, then me bringing up the rear. We were heading toward what Connor said was the old executive office area, supposedly untouched with vintage computers and everything still on the desks. About halfway across, where two catwalks intersected, Connor stopped so suddenly that Jake almost ran into him. There was a section ahead where 3 floor panels in a row were missing, creating a gap about 8 feet long. "We can go around," Melissa said, her voice tight with fear. But Connor was already studying the gap, shining his light on the beams underneath. The support structure was still there, 2 parallel I-beams about a foot apart that ran under where the panels used to be. Connor stepped out onto the first beam, arms out for balance, his sneakers gripping the rusty metal. He made it look easy, placing one foot in front of the other like he was walking on a sidewalk. Jake went next, taking it slower but steady, and then helped Melissa across from the other side. When it was my turn, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The beam was maybe 6 inches wide, covered in rust and bird crap, and through the gap between them I could see straight down to the concrete floor. Old machinery and debris waited below like teeth. I made it halfway when my foot slipped on something wet, probably pigeon droppings, and for a second I thought I was going over. My arms windmilled wildly, and I managed to catch myself, but in that moment of panic my flashlight went flying. It tumbled end over end through the darkness before shattering on the floor below. The others helped me across the rest of the way, and Jake gave me his backup flashlight, one of those tiny LED things that barely pushed back the darkness. We kept going, but I was rattled, my legs shaking with leftover adrenaline. The catwalk continued for another 50 feet, before reaching a door marked Administrative Wing in faded letters. Connor tried the handle, locked of course, but the wood around the deadbolt was rotted and soft. One solid kick from Jake and the whole thing splintered inward, revealing a hallway lined with offices. This part of the factory was different, carpeted and finished like a normal building, though everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and mold. We explored the offices, finding exactly what Connor had promised. Old computers, papers dated from 2008, coffee cups with dried rings at the bottom. In one executive office, there was a calendar still turned to November 2008. Appointments written in blue pen that would never be kept. Jake found a desk drawer full of promotional materials for a car model that never made it to production, glossy brochures for a future that never came. We spent maybe 20 minutes in the offices taking photos and joking around, the earlier tension starting to fade. Connor found an old bottle of scotch in a filing cabinet and took a swig, grimacing at the taste but passing it around anyway. That's when Jake noticed another door at the end of the hallway, this one metal with a small window. Through the dusty glass, we could see it opened onto another section of catwalks, these ones crossing over what looked like the main assembly area. Connor was already pushing through, eager to explore more, and we followed like idiots. These catwalks were worse than the first ones, narrower, with more missing panels, and the railings were loose in places, wobbling when you touched them. The drop here was even higher, maybe 40 feet. And below us massive pieces of machinery lurked in the shadows like sleeping monsters. We were moving single file, Connor in front, when we reached a junction where 3 walkways met. The intersection was wider, maybe 10 feet across, but the center panel was gone, leaving just the metal frame around the edges. Connor was already planning his route across the frame when Jake grabbed his shoulder. "Hold up, man. Let me test it first." Jake was the biggest of us, built solid from years of manual labor, and if it could hold him, it could hold anyone. He stepped onto the frame, one foot then the other, arms out for balance. The metal groaned, but held. He was almost across when we heard it, a deep metallic crack like a gunshot. The frame didn't break, but one of the bolts holding it to the catwalk had sheared off, and the whole section tilted. Jake lunged forward, trying to reach the other side, but his foot went through the gap. His leg disappeared up to the thigh, his body slamming down hard on the metal edge, and then he was sliding backward. His hands scrabbled for purchase on the smooth metal, fingernails scraping, and then found the edge of a beam. He caught himself with both hands, his body dangling through the hole, legs kicking in empty air 40 feet above the factory floor. The jagged metal had torn through his jeans and into his thigh on the way down. I could see blood, black in the dim light, running down his leg and dripping into the darkness below. Melissa screamed, the sound echoing through the factory like an alarm. Connor and I dropped to our stomachs, reaching through the hole trying to grab Jake's wrists. His face was twisted in pain and terror, teeth gritted, arms already shaking from the strain. The metal edge was cutting into his palms. I could see the blood making his grip slippery. "Pull me up," he gasped, his voice high and desperate. Connor had one wrist, I had the other, and we pulled with everything we had. But Jake weighed at least 200 pounds, and the angle was all wrong. We managed to lift him maybe 6 inches before our own grip started failing. Melissa was on her phone, trying to call 911, but there was no signal this deep in the building. That's when we heard them. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing from somewhere below. Not the light, careful steps of urban explorers, but the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Jake heard them too, his eyes going wide. "Someone's down there," he whispered, as if being quiet would help, as if whoever it was hadn't already heard Melissa's scream. The footsteps got closer, and then we saw the light, a powerful beam sweeping across the factory floor below, much brighter than our pathetic flashlights. It swept back and forth methodically, like whoever was carrying it was searching for something, or someone. The beam paused on the drops of Jake's blood hitting the concrete, then traced upwards slowly, deliberately, until it hit Jake's dangling form. We were blinded for a second, white light flooding our vision, and then the light moved up to find our faces peering through the hole. I couldn't see who was holding it, just a dark silhouette behind that blazing beam. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever, just the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the distant drip of his blood. Then the figure below started walking again, not running, not hurrying, just walking with that same measured pace. The footsteps echoed off in a different direction, and we heard a door slam somewhere in the darkness. "He's coming up," Connor said, his voice barely a whisper. "He knows the layout, he's coming up to us." That snapped us into action. Connor and I pulled harder, Melissa grabbing Jake under his armpits, all three of us straining against his weight. Jake was grunting with pain, his torn hands slipping, leaving bloody smears on the metal. We could hear doors slamming now, getting closer, echoing through the administrative wing we'd just explored. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. With one final, desperate heave, we got Jake's chest up to the edge. He threw one leg over, rolled onto the catwalk, and lay there gasping, blood pooling beneath his torn thigh. We didn't have time to check how bad it was. Connor was already pulling him to his feet, throwing Jake's arm over his shoulder. We ran, or tried to. Jake could barely put weight on his injured leg, hopping and stumbling, leaving a trail of blood behind us. We could hear the footsteps on the metal catwalks now, moving fast, knowing exactly which paths to take, which panels to avoid. We retraced our route, Jake crying out every time his foot hit the ground, Melissa supporting his other side. When we reached the gap with the I-beams, the 8-foot stretch that had seemed manageable before, we knew we were trapped. Jake couldn't make it across, not with his leg torn up, not with his hands bloody and weak. Behind us, the footsteps had stopped. We turned around, and there he was, a man in his 60s wearing a security uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His face was weathered and deeply lined, with pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough. He was holding a police-style flashlight, the heavy metal kind that doubles as a weapon. "You kids need to leave," he said, his voice raspy like he didn't use it much. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Connor started to explain about Jake being hurt, but the man cut him off. "I don't care. You leave now or I call the real cops. Your friend bleeds out up here, that's on you." He stepped aside, pointing his light at the beam crossing. "Go on. Same way you came." We didn't have a choice. Connor went first, then came back to help Jake. Together we basically carried him across, his feet barely touching the beams, all of us certain we were going to fall. Melissa went next, crying, and then me. The man watched us the whole time, never offering to help, never moving from his spot. When we finally made it to the other side, he called out, "I see you here again. We're going to have a different kind of conversation. This place ain't for you." The key to St. Augustine's felt heavier than it should have in my pocket as I walked across the overgrown parking lot that Tuesday afternoon. Architecture students don't usually get to explore abandoned buildings alone for their thesis projects, but the County Historical Society had actually approved my request to document this Gothic revival church that had been shuttered since 2006. While everyone else in my program was obsessing over glass facades and sustainable materials, I'd chosen to focus on historical preservation for my final year. The building stood there against the gray sky, all weathered limestone and broken promises, about 40 minutes outside the city in this forgotten part of the county. I'd brought my measuring tape, my Nikon, 2 notebooks, and enough enthusiasm to fill the empty sanctuary. The massive oak doors groaned when I unlocked them, and that sound echoed across the empty lot like the building itself was waking up after 15 years of sleeping. Inside, the main sanctuary stole my breath in a way no modern building ever could. Colored light filtered through stained glass windows that had somehow survived decades of neglect, painting geometric patterns across rows of dust-covered pews. The carved columns reached up toward a vaulted ceiling that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, creating this oppressive quiet that made me hyper-aware of my own breathing. I spent the first 2 hours documenting everything upstairs: the altar's intricate woodwork, the stone baptismal font, the choir loft with its ancient organ pipes. Every surface had this thick coating of dust that kicked up with the slightest movement, making me sneeze and leaving strange patterns in the air. The Historical Society's notes mentioned original foundation stones from the 1890s in the basement level, architectural details that would be perfect for my research on 19th century church construction. Around 3 o'clock, I headed toward the narrow door marked lower-level access near the back of the sanctuary. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight in a way that made me grip the railing harder than necessary. There was no electricity down there, but I'd brought a decent flashlight knowing the basement would be dark. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing stone walls that wept moisture, and a ceiling so low I had to duck in places even though I'm only 5'6". The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees as I descended, and this damp, heavy air wrapped around me like a wet blanket. About halfway down, I noticed the smell, just a hint at first. Something sweet and wrong mixed with the expected mustiness. I figured maybe a family of raccoons had gotten in and died somewhere in the walls. It happens in old buildings all the time. The basement itself was larger than I expected, divided into several rooms that probably served as storage and Sunday school classrooms back when the church was active. My flashlight beam swept across old folding tables, stacks of moldy hymnals, and children's drawings still tacked to a bulletin board, their crayon colors faded to ghosts of purple and yellow. The smell got stronger as I moved deeper into the basement, documenting the stone foundation with my camera. It was this thick, cloying sweetness that stuck to the inside of my nose and made me breathe through my mouth. I found myself rushing through my measurements, not taking as many photos as I should have, just wanting to get the basic documentation done. In the furthest room, the one that must have been directly under the altar, the smell was so intense I had to pull my shirt up over my nose. There was this old wooden door in the back corner, probably leading to some kind of maintenance room or old coal cellar. The door was slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches open, and I could tell that's where the smell was coming from. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, flashlight beam trained on that gap, trying to convince myself to go check it out. But something in my gut, this primal instinct I couldn't explain, kept me frozen in place. The air coming from that room felt different, heavier somehow, and I had this sudden, irrational certainty that I needed to leave immediately. I practically ran back through the basement, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the stone walls. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was doing, telling myself I'd gotten enough photos, that the smell was making me nauseous, that I could always come back another day with someone else. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was terrified, and I didn't even understand why. The stairs seemed to go on forever as I climbed back up, and when I finally burst through into the sanctuary, I actually gasped at the regular air like I'd been holding my breath. The late afternoon sun streaming through those stained glass windows had never looked so welcoming. I grabbed my equipment bag from the front pew where I'd left it, shoved my camera and notebooks inside without organizing anything, and headed straight for the doors. My professor would probably dock points for incomplete documentation, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that place. The drive home was strange because the further I got from the church, the more ridiculous I felt about my reaction. By the time I reached my apartment near campus, I'd almost convinced myself I was being dramatic, maybe getting my period or something, and that's why I'd overreacted to a bad smell in an old basement. I took a long shower, ordered Chinese food, and spent the evening organizing the photos I'd managed to take. The building really was architecturally significant. Those foundation stones were definitely from the original 1890s construction, and the sanctuary had details you just don't see anymore. I made notes about going back the following week, maybe bringing my friend Bethany, who was also into old buildings. That night I slept fine, didn't even dream about the place, and Wednesday passed without me thinking about it much at all, except to email the Historical Society, thanking them for the access and mentioning I'd return the key soon. Thursday morning changed everything. I was in the campus coffee shop around 9, scrolling through my phone while waiting for my latte, when the local news alert popped up. Human remains discovered in abandoned church, police investigation underway. My heart started hammering before my brain even processed what I was reading. The article was brief but specific. Maintenance workers preparing St. Augustine's Catholic Church for potential demolition had discovered badly decomposed human remains in a basement storage area. The body, which authorities believed had been there for several weeks, was found in what the article described as a concealed maintenance room. They'd posted a photo of the church's exterior with yellow police tape across those same oak doors I'd unlocked just 2 days earlier. I stood there in the coffee shop, phone trembling in my hand, while other students grabbed their drinks and chatted about normal things like upcoming exams and weekend plans. I threw up in the coffee shop bathroom. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly emptied my stomach while sitting on the floor of the handicapped stall, thinking about that wooden door in the basement's furthest room. 3 inches. It had been open 3 inches, and all that had stopped me from pushing it wider was some instinctive revulsion I couldn't even name. The article said the body had been there for weeks, which meant when I was down there taking photos, measuring stones, breathing through my shirt because of the smell, someone's son or daughter or parent was decomposing maybe 20 feet away from me. The maintenance workers had apparently opened that door looking for the source of what they called an unbearable odor. The same smell I'd tried to convince myself was just dead raccoons. I sat on that bathroom floor for probably 20 minutes, replaying every second I'd spent in that basement, wondering if the person had still been alive when the church was locked up, if they'd died trying to get out, if they'd screamed for help in a building designed to swallow sound. The police called me that afternoon. Apparently, the Historical Society had given them a list of everyone who'd had access to the church recently, and I was the last person who'd signed out the key. The detective, a woman named Hawkins with a voice that sounded tired, asked me to come to the station to answer some questions. I drove there in this weird state of numbness, part of me still hoping maybe they'd found old remains, something from decades ago that had nothing to do with my visit. But Detective Hawkins crushed that hope pretty quickly. The body was a man named Gregory Vance, 63 years old, reported missing 3 weeks earlier by his daughter. He'd been living on the streets for about a year after losing his job and his home. and his daughter said he sometimes sought shelter in abandoned buildings. The detective showed me his photo, a regular-looking guy with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt in what looked like a family barbecue photo. He'd probably gone into the church looking for a safe place to sleep and somehow gotten trapped in that maintenance room. Detective Hawkins kept asking if I'd noticed anything unusual, if I'd seen any signs of forced entry, if I'd explored the entire basement. I told her about the smell, about approaching that door, about leaving without checking further. She nodded and wrote things down, but I could see something in her expression, not judgment exactly, but maybe disappointment. If I'd pushed that door open on Tuesday, if I'd called 911 about finding Gregory Vance's body, his daughter could have started grieving 2 days sooner instead of wondering where her father was. The detective said the maintenance room's door had a broken lock mechanism that sometimes jammed from the inside. Gregory had probably pulled it shut for privacy and then couldn't get it open again. The basement had no windows, no other exit, and with the church abandoned, no one to hear him calling for help. She estimated he'd been dead for about 2 weeks when I was there based on decomposition. 2 weeks of him lying in the dark while his daughter put up missing person flyers and checked hospitals and hoped he was just staying with someone she didn't know. I left the police station around 5:30 and drove straight to my parents' house instead of my apartment. I needed to be somewhere that felt completely separate from all of this, somewhere with normal sounds and cooking smells and my mom asking about school. But I couldn't eat dinner, couldn't focus on their questions about my thesis, couldn't stop thinking about Gregory Vance slowly dying of dehydration or hypothermia or panic in that locked room. My dad, who's always been good at reading me, finally asked what was really wrong, and I told them everything. My mom held me while I cried. Not the pretty kind of crying, but the ugly, snotty kind that comes from realizing you were inches away from something horrible and didn't know it. She kept saying it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known, that I did nothing wrong by leaving. But I've seen enough true crime shows to know that bodies discovered quickly mean more evidence, faster identification, answers for families. Those 2 extra days of decomposition, of evidence degrading, of his daughter not knowing, that was because I'd been too scared to push open a door. I never went back to get the photos off my camera's memory card for my thesis project, changed my topic to a modern community center being built downtown, something clean and new with good lighting and no basements. The Historical Society understood when I mailed back the key with a note saying I couldn't continue the documentation. Gregory Vance's obituary ran in the paper a week later. He'd been a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant for 30 years, had 3 grandchildren, loved fishing. His daughter organized a proper funeral with the money raised through GoFundMe, and even though I didn't know him, I went. Sat in the back row of a different church, one with electric lights and working heat, listening to people share memories of a man who died alone in the dark because a door lock failed. It's been 4 months now, and I still can't walk past abandoned buildings without wondering who might be inside, what door might be jammed, what smell might be drifting up from some forgotten room. My roommate thinks I'm being dramatic when I insist on checking every door in our apartment each night, making sure none can lock from inside. But she wasn't there in that basement, didn't stand 3 inches from death and choose to walk away. Summer of 2016, I was 17, and dumb enough to think crawling through storm drains was a good way to kill time. Living in a suburb outside Denver meant you had to get creative with your entertainment, and my friends Brandon and Nate were always down for whatever stupid idea we came up with. My parents both pulled 12-hour shifts at the hospital, which left me with way too much freedom and a house that stayed empty most days. Brandon had just inherited this rust bucket Ford Ranger from his uncle, and having wheels made us feel invincible, like we could go anywhere and do anything without consequences. We'd been out of school for maybe 2 weeks when the boredom really started to hit. That Thursday in June started with us sitting in Nate's garage, passing around a bag of chips and scrolling through our phones, when Brandon brought up something his older brother had mentioned about these abandoned storm drains near the old rail yard. According to him, kids had been sneaking down there for years to party, tag the walls, basically do all the stuff you couldn't do topside without someone calling the cops. The rail yard sat on the east edge of town, past the industrial district where all the warehouses looked like they'd been empty since the 90s. We parked behind this collapsed loading dock and walked through knee-high weeds until we found the entrance. This massive concrete tube, maybe 8 feet across, partially hidden by a tangle of dead oak branches and garbage that had washed down from the street. The smell hit you first, like wet metal mixed with something organic that had been rotting for weeks. Brandon pulled out these heavy-duty flashlights he'd grabbed from his dad's workshop, the kind security guards carry that weigh about 5 pounds each. The opening was covered in layers of graffiti, fresh bubble letters sprayed over older tags, which were sprayed over even older stuff that looked like it had been carved into the concrete itself. A thin stream of brown water ran down the center, disappearing into the darkness where our flashlight beams couldn't reach. Nate kept cracking nervous jokes about contracting some disease or stumbling across a meth lab, but we all knew we were going in anyway. That's just how things worked with us. Nobody wanted to be the one who backed out first. We ducked into the tunnel single file, Brandon leading the way with his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. The concrete walls curved overhead, streaked with mineral deposits that looked like frozen waterfalls in the beam of light. Our footsteps echoed in this weird rhythmic pattern that bounced back at us from deeper in the system, making it sound like there were 6 of us walking instead of 3. About 50 feet in, we hit the first junction where the main tunnel split into 2 smaller passages. The left one angled down sharply, and you could hear water rushing somewhere below. The right stayed level but narrowed considerably, forcing you to hunch over if you were taller than 5'8". Brandon chose right without asking, probably because the left looked like a great way to slip and crack your skull open. The graffiti here was older, less artistic, mostly just names and dates going back to the 80s, some phone numbers that probably didn't exist anymore, and these weird symbols that looked almost like hobo code or something. The temperature kept dropping the further we went, and our breath started coming out in little clouds, even though it was probably 90 degrees outside. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, the tunnel opened up into this larger chamber where several pipes met. That's when we saw it in the corner, lit by 3 candles that were still burning. Someone had set up what looked like a whole living space. There was a sleeping bag laid out on a foam mattress, plastic milk crates stacked up like furniture, and trash bags full of what looked like clothes or blankets. Empty food cans were arranged in neat rows against the wall, labels all facing the same direction. A battery-powered radio sat on one of the crates, turned off but with a fresh pack of batteries sitting next to it still in the packaging. The candles threw these crazy shadows on the walls that made everything look like it was moving. But the thing that really got me was this notebook sitting open on top of the sleeping bag, with a pen placed carefully across the page like someone had just stopped writing mid-sentence. The whole setup was too organized, too deliberate. This wasn't some random homeless camp. This was someone's actual home. And from the looks of those burning candles, they couldn't have been gone for more than an hour or 2. Nate reached for the notebook, but Brandon grabbed his wrist before he could touch it. We all just stood there, flashlights dancing over this stranger's makeshift home, trying to process what we were looking at. The walls around the sleeping area were covered in newspaper clippings, all held up with duct tape and arranged in these perfect rows. Most of the articles were about missing pets from the neighborhood, going back months. There had to be at least 40 of them. Cats, dogs, even someone's rabbit. Each article had notes written in the margins with the same blue ballpoint pen, things like "found on elm," or "collar removed," or just dates with question marks. One of the milk crates had a collection of pet collars, maybe 15 or 20 of them, all different colors and sizes, some with tags still attached. I remember Brandon whispering that we needed to leave right now, but before anyone could move, we heard it. Footsteps splashing through water, coming from the left tunnel we'd passed earlier. Not running, just walking at this steady, measured pace, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going and had all the time in the world to get there. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber entrance, and for maybe 3 seconds, Everything went completely silent except for the sound of those candles flickering. Then a shape filled the tunnel opening. Tall, wearing what looked like a maintenance worker's coveralls that were way too big, dragging at the bottom. The person's face stayed in shadow, but I could see their hands clearly in our flashlight beams. The fingernails were long, curved, and caked with something dark underneath. They were holding what looked like a cloth sack in one hand, and it was moving, squirming like something alive was inside. Nobody said anything. The person tilted their head at this unnatural angle, like they were trying to see us better or maybe listening to something we couldn't hear. Then they took one step forward into the chamber, and their face caught the candlelight. Hollow cheeks, eyes that looked almost yellow in the dim light, and this perfectly calm expression like finding 3 teenagers in their secret underground home was the most normal thing in the world. They set the sack down carefully, never taking their eyes off us, and that's when we heard the muffled whimpering coming from inside it. Brandon was the first to break. He turned and bolted back the way we came, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the walls. Nate and I didn't need any more encouragement. We ran after him, our feet slipping on the wet concrete as we scrambled through the narrow tunnel. Behind us, I could hear the person moving, not running but walking with these long, deliberate strides that somehow seemed to keep pace with our panicked sprint. Their breathing echoed through the pipes, this raspy wheeze that bounced off the walls and made it sound like they were right behind us, even when they weren't. At the junction, Brandon went straight instead of turning left toward the exit, and we had no choice but to follow him deeper into the system. The tunnel here was older, rougher, with chunks of concrete missing from the ceiling and rust-colored water dripping steadily from exposed rebar. Our flashlights started cutting out intermittently, probably from all the shaking as we ran, leaving us in complete darkness for seconds at a time. During one of those blackouts, I slammed face first into a low-hanging pipe, splitting my lip open and filling my mouth with the taste of blood and rust. We hit a dead end, a metal grate blocking the tunnel completely, too small to squeeze through and too strong to break. Brandon was pulling at it desperately, his fingers already bleeding from the sharp edges, while Nate kept looking back the way we came, holding his flashlight with both hands to keep it steady. The footsteps had stopped, but we could still hear that breathing, getting closer but taking its time. Then the person started talking, not yelling or threatening, just speaking in this conversational tone like we were having coffee together. They were listing names: Whiskers, Buddy, Princess, Max, and after each name they'd make this clicking sound with their tongue. The sack they'd been carrying earlier must have still been with them, because we could hear scratching and whimpering between the names. They kept talking about how the animals trusted them, how easy it was to make friends with something hungry, how they'd been collecting for months and nobody ever came looking in the tunnels. The voice was getting closer, maybe 30 feet away now, and our flashlights were getting dimmer as the batteries died. Nate started crying, just standing there shaking and crying, while Brandon kept pulling at that grate like a trapped animal. The person emerged from the darkness just as Brandon's flashlight died completely. In Nate's weakening beam, we could see them clearly now, probably in their 40s, with patchy gray hair that hung in greasy strands past their shoulders. They were smiling, showing teeth that were surprisingly white and straight, which somehow made everything worse. They set the moving sack down gently and pulled out what looked like a leash from their pocket, one of those retractable ones that made a zipping sound as they played with the mechanism. "You 3 remind me of Cooper," they said, pointing at a golden retriever collar hanging from their belt. Cooper was curious too, came right up to me behind the grocery store, such a good boy. They took another step closer, and I could smell them now, like wet dog mixed with something chemical, maybe bleach or ammonia. Nate had backed himself into the corner where the wall met the grate, making these small whimpering sounds that sounded too much like whatever was in that sack. The person noticed and laughed, this normal, genuine laugh, like someone had told them a funny joke at work. That's when Brandon snapped. He grabbed his dead flashlight and threw it as hard as he could, hitting the person square in the forehead. They stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, and Brandon screamed at us to run. We shoved past the person while they were still off balance, Nate dropping his flashlight in the process, leaving us in total darkness. But Brandon remembered the way, left at the junction, then straight, following the sound of dripping water and the faint smell of outside air. Behind us, the person wasn't running, just walking and calling out pet names like they were trying to coax us back. "Here, kitty kitty, come on boy, that's a good girl." We could see a pinpoint of light ahead, real sunlight, and we ran toward it like our lives depended on it, which honestly, they probably did. The concrete scraped our hands and knees as we scrambled up the slight incline toward the exit. I could hear sirens in the distance. Turned out someone had seen Brandon's truck parked by the abandoned rail yard and called it in as suspicious activity. We burst out of that tunnel into the blazing afternoon sun, all three of us crying and bleeding and probably looking absolutely insane to the two cops who were just getting out of their patrol car. We tried to explain everything to the cops, the living space in the tunnels, the missing pet articles, the person with the sack, but we were so hysterical that nothing came out right. One officer stayed with us while the other went to check the tunnel entrance, but he only went about 20 feet in before coming back out, saying it was too dangerous without proper equipment and backup. They called it in, and within an hour there were fire trucks, animal control, and even a news van setting up in the rail yard. The fire department sent a team down with proper lights and safety gear, but they found nothing. No sleeping bag, no milk crates, no newspaper clippings, and definitely no person in maintenance coveralls. Even the notebook was gone. The only thing they found was a single pet collar caught on a piece of rebar about 50 yards in, a red one with a heart-shaped tag that said Bailey. The cops took our statements, called our parents, and basically told us we were lucky we only got scared. They suggested maybe we'd stumbled onto a homeless camp and our imaginations had run wild in the dark. Brandon's dad grounded him for the rest of the summer. Nate's parents made him start seeing a therapist, and my folks installed a tracking app on my phone that I couldn't delete until I turned 18. The story should have ended there. Just 3 stupid kids who scared themselves in a drainage tunnel. But 2 weeks later, I was walking home from my job at the grocery store when I saw them. The person from the tunnel, standing at the bus stop across from my house, wearing normal clothes this time, just jeans and a polo shirt. They were reading a newspaper, acting like any other person waiting for the bus. When they looked up and saw me, they smiled and waved, then held up the newspaper so I could see the headline, "Another missing pet story." This time a tabby cat named Oliver from our neighborhood. They folded the paper carefully, tucked it under their arm, and got on the bus when it arrived, never breaking eye contact until the doors closed. I never saw them again after that, but for the next year until we graduated and I left for college, missing pet posters kept appearing around town. The police never found anything. The tunnels got sealed with concrete barriers after our incident, and everyone seemed to forget about it, except for Brandon, Nate, and me. We never talked about it, not even with each other, but sometimes I'd catch one of them staring at missing pet posters a little too long, and I knew they were thinking the same thing I was. Somewhere in town, that person was still collecting, still making friends with hungry animals, still living their deeply disturbed life in broad daylight, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it. I'd been sleeping in abandoned houses around Philadelphia for about 2 months when I found the Victorian on Allegheny Street. 23 years old, college dropout, working random gigs that barely covered food. That was me in early 2018. My car had been repossessed in January, and the shelter wait lists were impossible. So I learned to spot the signs of a good squat. Broken padlocks that nobody bothered to replace, overgrown yards that meant the city had given up, and most importantly, other people's stuff already inside. That meant it was either safe enough or at least you wouldn't be alone if things went bad. I met Sophia outside the library one afternoon while we were both using the Wi-Fi. She had these thick dreadlocks with purple tips and this gap between her front teeth that made her look younger than she probably was. She's the one who told me about the house, said 7 people were already crashing there, and they had actual electricity. When she mentioned it used to belong to some dealer named Rico, who'd been locked up since 2013. I should have thought twice. But sleeping somewhere with heat and other people around sounded better than another night in a freezing warehouse. The house stood out even on a street full of abandoned properties. 3 stories of rotting Victorian grandeur, with faded green trim peeling off like dead skin. The porch slumped in the middle, held up by wooden pillars that looked ready to snap. And every window facing the street was boarded with plywood that had turned gray and soft from rain. Sophia showed me the side entrance where someone had pried off the board just enough to squeeze through, and she knocked this specific pattern 4 times, pause, then twice more. Inside, it was shockingly organized, like someone had tried to make it an actual home. Walter, this 60-something white guy with trembling hands from years of drinking, had rigged electricity from the streetlight outside and set up space heaters in 3 rooms. There was Janet and Paul, a black couple in their 40s who'd lost everything to medical debt, sleeping in what used to be the dining room. 2 kids couldn't have been older than 20, Destiny and Carlos, had claimed the smallest bedroom upstairs. The living room still had all of Rico's old furniture. This hideous gold velvet couch covered in cigarette burns, a glass coffee table with one corner completely shattered and held together with duct tape, and strangest of all, an empty fish tank that still had blue gravel, and a little deep-sea diver figure standing at the bottom, like someone just forgot to add water one day and never remembered. For 3 weeks we had this weird routine that almost felt normal. Walter would wake up at 5 every morning and make instant coffee on the hot plate, the smell drifting through the whole house. Janet worked part-time at a dollar store and would bring back expired food they couldn't sell. Dented cans of soup, stale bread, sometimes even frozen stuff that was still good. Paul spent his days at the library applying for jobs on the computer, always wearing this same navy suit that he kept impossibly clean despite everything. Destiny and Carlos would disappear during the day, coming back with random things they'd found or stolen. Toilet paper from restaurant bathrooms, half-eaten pizzas from dumpsters behind colleges, once even a whole rotisserie chicken still warm from Giant Eagle. We'd eat dinner together most nights, sitting on that ugly gold couch or on milk crates around the broken coffee table, sharing whatever we had. Sophia would tell these wild stories about hitchhiking across the country, how she'd lived in a commune in New Mexico where they grew their own food, how she'd worked on a fishing boat in Alaska for a summer, even in that decaying house that smelled like mold and old cigarettes, with police sirens going off every hour and trains rattling past on the nearby tracks. It felt safer than being alone. Everything changed on a Monday night in February. I remember because Janet had just gotten paid and brought back a bunch of canned chili, and we were actually having a good time, joking about opening a restaurant called Rock Bottom Cafe. Around 11, just as most of us were settling in for the night, we heard this car pull up outside. Not unusual, except the engine kept running. Then footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate, not trying to be quiet like cops would. We all went silent, that kind of stillness where you can hear everyone's breathing. The footsteps stopped right at the front door, which we never used because it was visible from the street. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then there was this sound I'll never forget. Metal scraping against wood, followed by this massive thunk that shook the whole door frame. The scraping sound came again, and another thunk, and we realized someone was driving something through the door from the outside. Walter grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the front hallway, while the rest of us huddled in the living room. When he came back, his face was completely white. He said there was a machete, not a knife, a fucking machete, sticking through the front door, buried so deep the blade came out the other side by about 6 inches. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever. We just stared at each other while that car engine kept rumbling outside. Then, as suddenly as it arrived, we heard the car door slam, and it drove off, tires squealing as it turned the corner. Carlos wanted to go look, maybe get a license plate, but Walter grabbed his arm and told him not to be stupid. Janet was whispering prayers under her breath while Paul held her, and Sophia had this look on her face like she'd seen this kind of thing before. Destiny started packing her stuff right then and there, shoving her clothes into a garbage bag, saying she wasn't staying another minute. but Walter convinced us to wait until morning. The streets were more dangerous at night, and whoever that was might still be watching. We pushed the couch and everything heavy we could find against the front door, then took turns staying awake in pairs, watching the windows. I was paired with Sophia for the 3 to 6 shift, and she told me this probably had to do with Rico's old business. Maybe someone thought there were still drugs or money hidden in the house. She said her ex-boyfriend used to deal, and leaving a weapon like that was a message, either to scare someone or mark territory. The machete stayed there all night, wobbling slightly whenever a truck passed by and shook the house. When the sun came up, we could finally see the full extent of what had happened. The machete was even bigger than we'd thought, probably 2 feet long with a black rubber handle wrapped in duct tape. It had gone through the solid wood door like it was cardboard, and there were fresh scratches on the door frame where someone had used it to pull themselves up, like they'd put their whole body weight behind driving it in. Paul wanted to call the cops, but everyone else shot that down immediately. We were trespassing, and half of us had warrants or records that would land us in jail. Walter said he knew some guys from his construction days who might buy the machete for scrap metal, but nobody wanted to touch it. Around noon, I decided I needed air and walked to the corner store for cigarettes. When I came back 20 minutes later, everyone was outside on the sidewalk with their stuff. The front door was wide open, the machete was gone, and Sophia grabbed my arm before I could go inside. She said about 5 minutes after I left, 3 men in ski masks had walked right in through the side entrance like they knew exactly where it was. They didn't say a word, just started going through every room, throwing mattresses, dumping out bags, even pulling up loose floorboards in the kitchen. Everyone ran out the front door. The men didn't try to stop them, didn't even look at them, just kept searching. We stood there on the sidewalk for maybe 10 minutes, everyone arguing about what to do. Janet wanted to leave right away. Paul kept saying we should wait and go back for our things. And Walter was convinced the men were looking for Rico's stash that probably didn't even exist anymore. Then we heard this crash from inside, like furniture being flipped, followed by what sounded like walls being hit with something heavy, probably a sledgehammer from the sound. That's when I noticed Carlos wasn't with us. Destiny started screaming his name, completely hysterical, saying he'd gone upstairs to grab his backpack right before the men showed up. Before anyone could stop her, she ran toward the house. Sophia and I grabbed her just as she reached the porch, and that's when we heard it. A man's voice from inside, low and calm, saying, "Where is it?" over and over. And another voice, younger, crying and saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was Carlos. The calm voice said something in Spanish I couldn't understand. Then there was this wet sound, like meat being tenderized, and Carlos screamed. Not like in movies. This was raw animal panic. Destiny was fighting us, trying to get inside, and Walter had to practically carry her across the street while she sobbed and cursed at us for not letting her go. The sounds from inside continued for maybe 5 more minutes. Furniture breaking, that calm voice asking questions, Carlos responding but his voice getting weaker. Then everything went quiet. We watched from across the street as the 3 men walked out the front door like they had all the time in the world. 2 of them were carrying black duffel bags that looked heavy, and the third one, the biggest, had blood on his jacket sleeve. They didn't run, didn't even look at us standing right there in plain sight. They got into a black SUV with tinted windows that had been parked around the corner and drove away at normal speed, even stopping at the stop sign. Destiny broke free and ran into the house before any of us could react. We heard her scream from upstairs, this horrible, broken sound that just kept going. When Sophia and I went in after her, the place was destroyed. Every piece of furniture flipped or smashed, holes punched in the walls. Even the ceiling tiles in the kitchen had been pulled down. We found Destiny in the small bedroom, kneeling next to Carlos. He was conscious but barely, curled up in a ball, his face swollen beyond recognition, blood pooling on the floor from a gash on his scalp. His left arm was bent at an angle that made me want to throw up, and he kept making these small, whimpering sounds like a hurt dog. Paul called 911 from a payphone down the street, while the rest of us tried to help Carlos. Sophia knew some basic first aid from her time in that commune, and used torn sheets to put pressure on his head wound. Carlos kept trying to talk through his swollen lips, saying something about how they kept asking about the package and wouldn't believe him when he said he didn't know anything. Walter found the duffel bags the men had been carrying. Turns out they'd been hidden inside the walls, behind some loose panels in the basement none of us had ever noticed. There were still traces of white powder in the corners of the bags and rubber band marks on the floor where money bundles had probably been. Rico's stash had been there the whole time, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of drugs and cash, just sitting behind the walls while we slept 20 feet away. The ambulance arrived in about 15 minutes, and the EMTs didn't ask questions. They'd seen this kind of thing before. As they loaded Carlos onto the stretcher, one of them quietly told Destiny that if we were smart, we'd be gone before the cops showed up to investigate. The neighbors had started coming out of their houses, and I heard one old woman telling another that she knew something like this would happen, that Rico's cousins had been coming around asking questions for weeks. We scattered within the hour. Janet and Paul went to stay with her sister in Jersey. Walter said he knew a guy with a warehouse where he could crash, and Destiny went with Carlos in the ambulance, refusing to leave his side. That left me and Sophia standing on the sidewalk with our garbage bags of belongings, trying to figure out our next move. She had a friend in Fishtown who might let us stay for a few nights, but we needed to get across the city and neither of us had money for the bus. As we started walking, I made the mistake of looking back at the house one more time. There was already a new padlock on the side entrance, and I swear I saw someone watching us from the third-floor window. Just a shadow that moved away when I looked directly at it. Sophia saw it too and grabbed my hand, pulling me along faster. We walked for 2 hours straight, not stopping until we reached the bridge over the Delaware. She finally broke the silence, saying that in all her years on the streets, she'd never been that close to dying. Those men hadn't cared who was in the house. If they'd thought any of us knew where their money was, we'd all have ended up like Carlos or worse. The scary part was how professional they were, how they knew exactly where to look, like someone had told them precisely where Rico had hidden everything. 3 days later, I was staying at a women's shelter in South Philly when I saw the news on TV. They'd found 2 bodies in a house on Allegheny Street. Not our house, but one just 3 doors down. The reporter said it was drug-related, that the victims were known associates of a dealer who'd been imprisoned years ago. They showed a picture of the victims, and my heart stopped. It was 2 guys I'd never seen before, but Sophia later told me she recognized them from the neighborhood. They used to hang around our house sometimes, asking Walter if anyone had been inside lately, if we'd found anything interesting. Turns out they were Rico's cousins, the ones the old lady had mentioned, and they'd probably been killed by the same men who tortured Carlos. The news said they'd been dead for at least a week, which meant they were murdered before the machete incident, before the men came searching. Those cousins had probably been tortured for the location of Rico's stash, gave up the information, and then were killed anyway. We'd been living in that house the entire time, completely oblivious to the fact that we were sitting on top of a fortune that people were willing to kill for. If those men had come just a few days earlier, or if we'd found those hidden panels ourselves, we'd probably be dead too. I ran into Sophia one more time, about a month later at a food bank in Center City. She told me Carlos survived, but lost partial use of his left arm, and he and Destiny had left Philadelphia entirely, maybe headed to Florida where her family lived. Walter had gotten into a program and was trying to get sober. Janet and Paul were still at her sister's place trying to save up for their own apartment. As for the house, Sophia said she'd walked by it the previous week out of curiosity. It had been completely gutted, windows removed, doors taken off, even parts of the walls had been torn down. The city had put up official condemned notices and metal barriers over every entrance. But the really unsettling part was what she'd heard from other people still living on the streets in that area. They said that sometimes at night cars would still pull up to the house, people would get out and walk around it, like they were checking to make sure it stayed empty. Nobody squatted there anymore, even though winter was coming and desperate people needed shelter. The house had become a kind of urban legend among the homeless community, a cautionary tale about the dangers of sleeping in the wrong place. Looking back now, I realize how incredibly lucky we were. We'd spent 3 weeks living inside a ticking time bomb, surrounded by hidden drug money, with Rico's associates circling like vultures. The only reason we survived was pure chance. We were nobodies, not worth interrogating or killing, just obstacles to be pushed aside while they reclaimed what they thought was theirs. Photography has been my escape since college, and last April I finally had a free Saturday to explore the old Riverside paper mill, about 40 minutes outside of town. I was 28, teaching high school biology during the week, and spending weekends hunting for abandoned places to photograph. The mill had been shut down since the early 90s, and from what I'd researched online, it used to employ half the county before cheaper operations moved everything overseas. That morning, I packed my camera bag with extra batteries, grabbed a flashlight and some water, and drove out there alone. Something I usually avoided, but my regular exploring partner Jason was visiting family in Ohio. The building sat isolated behind overgrown chain-link fencing, its red brick walls covered in vines and graffiti, windows either boarded up or shattered into jagged teeth. Getting inside was easier than expected. Someone had already cut a person-sized hole in the fence near the loading dock, and one of the dock doors hung partially open, rusted off its tracks. The main floor stretched out like a cathedral of decay, with massive paper rolling machines standing silent under layers of dust and bird droppings. Shafts of light cut through gaps in the roof, creating these incredible contrast patterns that made my photographer's heart race with excitement. Spent the first hour just shooting the machinery, the peeling paint on the walls, and the way nature had started reclaiming the space through cracks in the concrete floor. The building had multiple levels connected by metal staircases, and I'd planned to work my way up systematically. But then I noticed a doorway at the back that led to what looked like an older section of the mill, probably from the original construction in the 1920s. The older section had a completely different feel: narrower hallways, lower ceilings, and this oppressive dampness that made breathing uncomfortable. My footsteps echoed differently here, more muffled, like the walls were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. The dust was thicker too, undisturbed except for a clear path down the center where someone had walked recently, maybe other urban explorers, though I hadn't seen any fresh graffiti or beer cans like you usually find. I followed the hallway past several small offices, their doors hanging open to reveal overturned desks and scattered papers yellowed with age. At the end of the corridor, a set of wooden stairs descended into what must have been a storage basement, and even though every rational part of my brain said to stick to the upper floors where there was natural light, I couldn't resist the pull of documenting spaces that probably hadn't been photographed in decades. The basement was a maze of concrete pillars and low-hanging pipes, with old chemical drums stacked against the walls, and the acrid smell of decades-old industrial solvents making my eyes water. I had to use my flashlight constantly down there, sweeping it back and forth to avoid tripping over debris or hitting my head on the pipes. About 50 feet in, I found this amazing spot where a partial collapse in the ceiling had created a natural skylight effect, with a single beam of dusty light illuminating a section of floor like a stage. I set up my tripod carefully, adjusting the legs to account for the uneven ground, and was framing the shot when I noticed something that made me pause. There were drag marks in the dust, 2 parallel lines about shoulder width apart, leading from the darkness beyond the pillars toward a section of floor that had completely caved in, creating a jagged hole about 6 feet across. At first I thought maybe someone had dragged equipment or scrap metal to dump it down the hole, but the marks were too uniform, too deliberate, and they had this weird pattern to them, like whoever made them had been struggling or stopping frequently. I abandoned my camera on the tripod and walked closer to the collapsed section, using my flashlight to peer down into the darkness below. The hole opened into what looked like a sub-basement, or maybe an old drainage tunnel, probably another 15 feet down, with chunks of concrete and twisted rebar jutting out at dangerous angles. The smell coming up from it was different from the chemical odor. Earthier, more organic, with this underlying sweetness that reminded me of composting leaves, but wrong somehow. Corrupted. I was about to step back when my flashlight caught something pale tangled in the rebar about halfway down. The fabric was a light blue, maybe denim or cotton work clothes, torn and stained dark in places that could have been rust or mud, but had this brownish-red color that looked too deliberate, too concentrated. I lay flat on my stomach, ignoring the filth and broken glass, and stretched my arm down with the flashlight to get a better angle. That's when I saw more pieces of fabric caught on different sections of rebar, and beneath them, partially buried under chunks of fallen concrete, there were other things. What might have been a work boot with the sole separated from the leather, something that could have been a tool belt or bag strap, and worst of all, these dark stains on the concrete chunks that had pooled and dried in patterns that absolutely were not rust. My whole body went rigid as my brain processed what I was looking at, and I scrambled backward so fast I knocked over a paint can, the metallic clang echoing through the basement like a gunshot. The echo hadn't even finished reverberating when I heard something else. Footsteps above me, deliberate and heavy, crossing the main factory floor. I grabbed my camera, fumbling with the tripod legs, trying to collapse them quickly while keeping my flashlight trained on the stairs I'd come down. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and dust drifted down through the cracks between the floorboards, dancing in my flashlight beam like snow. Whoever was up there knew exactly where I was, and they weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. I could hear them moving toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs, their pace unhurried, confident, like they knew I had nowhere to go. My mind raced through options. The hole was a death trap. The basement had no other exits that I'd seen, and confronting whoever was coming down those stairs seemed like the worst possible choice. I killed my flashlight and moved as quietly as possible behind one of the concrete pillars, clutching my camera bag against my chest to stop the equipment from rattling. The darkness was absolute except for that single shaft of light from the ceiling collapse, and I watched it like my life depended on it, waiting to see a shadow pass through. The footsteps reached the top of the wooden stairs, and each creak of the old board sent jolts through my nervous system. They descended slowly, pausing every few steps like they were listening for me, and I held my breath until my lungs burned. When they reached the basement floor, I heard them walk directly to the collapsed section, their feet crunching on the broken glass and debris I'd disturbed. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. And then I heard something that made my insides turn to water, the sound of them dragging something heavy across the floor, something that scraped and caught on the rough concrete, heading straight toward the hole. The dragging stopped right at the edge of the collapse, and I heard a grunt of effort followed by the sickening sound of something heavy tumbling down into the hole, crashing against the rebar and concrete below. The person above muttered something I couldn't make out, their voice low and gravelly, definitely male, and then started kicking loose debris down after whatever they'd dropped. Each piece of concrete that fell made me flinch, knowing I'd been lying in that exact spot just minutes earlier, my face inches from evidence of what this place really was. Through a gap between the pipes, I could barely make out a silhouette in that shaft of light. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like coveralls and heavy work boots. He pulled something from his pocket, and I heard the distinctive click of a lighter, followed by the smell of cigarette smoke mixing with all the other toxic scents in the air. He stood there smoking for several minutes, occasionally nudging more debris into the hole with his boot, completely casual like this was routine maintenance work. I stayed frozen behind the pillar, my leg muscles cramping from holding the same position, terrified that any movement would give me away. The cigarette glowed orange in the darkness as he took long drags, and I could see him checking his watch in the lighter's flame when he lit a second one. Finally, he flicked the butt down the hole and started walking back toward the stairs. But then he stopped suddenly and turned his head like he was listening. I heard him walk to where I'd left my tripod. In my panic, I'd only grabbed the camera, leaving the expensive carbon fiber tripod standing there like a beacon. He picked it up, collapsed it with practiced efficiency, and carried it with him as he headed back to the stairs, his footsteps now quicker, more purposeful. I waited in that basement for another 2 hours after his footsteps faded completely, until my phone showed 4 p.m. and the shaft of light had shifted angles. Every tiny sound made me think he was coming back, that he was waiting for me upstairs, that he knew exactly where I was hiding. When I finally worked up the courage to move, my joints were so stiff I nearly fell over, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from crying out. I crept up the stairs one at a time, pausing at the top to listen for any sign of movement in the building. The main floor was empty, but I could see fresh boot prints in the dust leading to the loading dock where I'd entered. My car was still there, untouched, but there was a folded piece of paper under the windshield wiper. With shaking fingers, I unfolded it to find a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning, with a handwritten note on the back. Beautiful equipment. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Or to you. I drove straight to the police station in town, showed them the photos I'd managed to take before seeing the drag marks, and tried to explain what I'd found. 2 officers went out to investigate that evening, but they came back saying the basement floor had been completely filled with fresh concrete. Someone had dumped what must have been several trucks worth down there, sealing everything. They took my statement, said they'd look into it, but I could tell from their expressions they thought I was either lying or had imagined things. The officer in charge suggested that urban exploration was dangerous and illegal, that I was lucky nothing worse had happened. I never went back to check, never posted those photos online, and eventually deleted them entirely. I still have that hardware store receipt though. Keep it in a drawer as a reminder that some abandoned places should stay abandoned, that some secrets are buried for a reason, and that someone out there knows I know what that mill really is. A tomb disguised as ruins. The old Westfield Elementary had been sitting empty on Route 49 for almost 15 years when we decided to break in that Friday night in 2017. I was 17, stuck in small-town Indiana for the summer, counting down the days until I could escape to college. My parents ran the only hardware store in town, and I'd been working there since I was old enough to carry a paint can without dropping it. Most nights after closing, I'd meet up with the same group of friends behind the abandoned gas station on Miller Road. It was either that, or drive 40 minutes to the nearest mall. That night there were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Tommy, who'd been my neighbor since 3rd grade, his girlfriend Ashley, who worked at the diner on Main Street, this new kid Kevin, who'd moved here from Chicago and wouldn't shut up about how much better the city was, and Kevin's cousin Daniela, who was visiting for a couple weeks and barely spoke to any of us. We were passing around a bag of gas station chips and arguing about whether the town's single movie theater would ever show anything besides kids' movies when Kevin brought up the school. He claimed his older brother had tried to get inside last year but got spooked when he saw shadows moving behind the boarded-up windows on the 2nd floor. Tommy laughed so hard he nearly choked on his energy drink, calling the brother every name in the book for being such a coward. Before I knew it, Tommy was standing up, crushing his empty can against the brick wall, and declaring that we were going to prove we weren't afraid of some burned-out elementary school. Ashley tried to act bored by the whole idea, but I could tell she didn't want to be the one to back down. Daniela just kept scrolling through her phone, barely looking up when she mumbled that she'd go if everyone else was going. Kevin looked like he regretted bringing it up, but his pride wouldn't let him back out now. Within 10 minutes, we were all piled into Tommy's ancient Corolla, the one with the passenger door that wouldn't open from the inside and a radio that only picked up the Christian station. The school was 20 minutes outside town, past the corn processing plant and down a stretch of road where the streetlights had stopped working years ago. We parked behind a cluster of dead trees about 100 yards from the building, figuring it was better to walk the rest of the way in case someone drove by and saw the car. The moment we got out, the summer heat gave way to this weird chill that comes with abandoned places, like the air itself knows nobody belongs there anymore. The school was a 2-story brick building, probably built in the 60s judging by those narrow windows and flat roof. Half of it was completely charred black from the fire Kevin mentioned, with the roof caved in on the east wing. The other half looked mostly intact from the outside, except every single window had been covered with plywood sheets, and someone had spray-painted "Keep Out" across the main entrance in red paint that had dripped down like blood in a horror movie. The chain-link fence surrounding the property had been cut open in at least 3 different spots, and we picked the widest gap to squeeze through. Tommy led the way with his phone flashlight, trying to act tough even though I noticed him hesitating every few steps. The main entrance was sealed tight, massive sheets of plywood nailed over the double doors with what must have been 100 nails, some of them bent and rusty like people had tried to pry them out before giving up. We circled around to the back of the building, our shoes crunching on broken glass and dead leaves that had accumulated over the years. Kevin pointed out a ground floor window on the intact side where the plywood had been partially pried away, leaving just enough space for someone to squeeze through if they didn't mind getting scraped up. The wood was splintered at the edges, and there were fresh scratches in the paint around the opening. Clearly, we weren't the first ones to find this entrance. Tommy went first, of course, grunting as he pulled himself through the gap. We heard him drop down inside with a thud and a string of curses before he called back that it was safe. Ashley went next, then me, then Kevin, and finally Daniela, who had to be convinced twice that she could fit through the opening. Inside, we found ourselves in what used to be a cafeteria kitchen. Stainless steel counters were still bolted to the walls, though they were covered in rust and graffiti. The floor was littered with old food trays, broken ceiling tiles, and puddles of water from leaks in the roof. The smell hit us immediately, mildew mixed with something chemical, probably from whatever cleaning supplies had been left behind to rot. Our phone lights created these crazy shadows that danced across the walls as we moved, making every corner look like something was hiding there. We made our way out of the kitchen and into the main cafeteria, where long tables were still arranged in rows, some flipped over, others still standing like students might walk in any minute for lunch. The walls were covered in layers of graffiti, tags from different years overlapping each other, dates going back to 2005, names of couples who probably broke up years ago. Tommy was already heading toward a set of double doors that led to the main hallway, acting like he owned the place. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with classroom doors, most of them hanging open at weird angles. Water damage had warped the wooden doors, and the drop ceiling had collapsed in several places, leaving tangles of wires and insulation hanging down like intestines. We picked the left side first, poking our heads into empty classrooms where desks were either missing or stacked against walls. Everything was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for over a decade. Dust, decay, and the occasional piece of furniture too heavy for scavengers to steal. But then we reached the last classroom at the end of the hall, room 108, and everything changed. The door was closed but not locked, and when Tommy pushed it open, we all just stood there staring. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, 5 across and 6 deep, all facing the blackboard at the front. Not pushed around or flipped over like every other room, arranged like class was about to start. But the really disturbing part was the graffiti on the walls. While the rest of the building had layers upon layers of old tags, faded and overlapping, this room had fresh writing. I mean fresh. The black marker still had that chemical smell when you got close to it. The writing covered every inch of the walls from floor to about shoulder height, all in the same neat handwriting. Not gang tags or curse words like you'd expect, but weird phrases repeated over and over. They watch from the ceiling tiles, written maybe 50 times along one wall. Don't trust the janitor's closet, in perfect cursive along another. Class never ended for Rebecca, spelled out in block letters near the windows. Ashley grabbed my arm when she noticed the dates scattered throughout the writing. Some were from just a week ago, others from 3 days ago. The most recent one, near the door frame where we'd just entered, was from yesterday. Tommy tried to play it cool, saying someone was obviously just messing with people who broke in, but his voice cracked when he said it. Kevin walked over to one of the desks and opened it. Inside was a math textbook from 2002, the pages yellowed but otherwise perfect, and a pencil box with everything still neatly arranged inside. Daniela was the one who noticed the teacher's desk wasn't empty either. There was a grade book open on top, and when she got closer with her phone light, we could see names written in it. Recent names, not from when the school was open. First names only. Anthony, absent. Megan, present. Luis, present. Rebecca. And then nothing, just a dark ink stain where the pen had leaked onto the page. The dates at the top of each column went back about a month, with perfect attendance tracked for invisible students. Tommy grabbed the book and flipped through it, page after page of the same thing. Attendance records for a class that didn't exist, going back months. That's when we heard it for the first time. Footsteps directly above us, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. Not the random creaking of an old building, but the distinct rhythm of someone walking from one end of a room to the other. We all looked up at the ceiling, following the sound with our eyes as it moved across the room above us, stopped for a moment, then walked back. Kevin immediately pulled out his phone to record, whispering that we needed proof, or no one would believe us. The footsteps continued their pattern, 8 steps one way, pause, 8 steps back. Too consistent to be an animal, too heavy to be the wind moving something around. Tommy, trying to regain his tough guy status, announced he was going upstairs to check it out. Ashley told him he was insane, but he was already heading back to the hallway. The rest of us followed, not because we wanted to, but because splitting up seemed worse. The stairwell was at the center of the building, behind a heavy metal door that screamed when we pushed it open. Our phone lights barely penetrated the darkness inside, and the stairs were covered in debris, chunks of plaster, old papers, what looked like clothing bunched up in the corners. The footsteps above had stopped the moment we opened the stairwell door, which somehow made everything worse. We climbed slowly, Tommy first, then me, the girls in the middle, and Kevin bringing up the rear, still recording everything. Halfway up, Daniela grabbed Ashley's hand and whispered that we should leave, but Tommy was already at the top, pushing through another door into the second-floor hallway. The second floor was in worse shape than the first. The fire damage was more evident here. Black scorch marks crawled across the walls, and several doorways were completely blocked by collapsed ceiling beams. The smell of old smoke still lingered, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. We stood clustered together at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing, just our own breathing and the distant sound of wind through broken windows somewhere. Then Tommy's light caught something that made us all step back, fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the stairwell down the hall toward the intact classrooms. Not old prints, but clear, recent ones. The dust still settled in perfect shoe patterns. Adult-sized boots with a distinctive tread pattern, like work boots. The prints went both directions, overlapping in places like someone had been walking back and forth for a while. Ashley whispered that we should go back downstairs and just leave, but Tommy was already following the footprints, and somehow we all ended up following him, our lights creating a moving bubble of visibility in the darkness. The footprints led to a classroom door that was slightly ajar, room 204 according to the faded number plate. Tommy reached for the handle, and that's when the footsteps started again, but this time they were running. Heavy boots pounding across the floor somewhere further down the hall, getting closer. We all turned our lights toward the sound, and for a split second I swear I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, tall and wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. Then our lights flickered, all of our phones at the exact same moment, and when they came back on, the hallway was empty. But the running footsteps continued, getting louder, definitely coming our way. Tommy yanked open the door to room 204 and shoved us all inside, pulling it shut behind us. We stood there in complete darkness because our phones had all gone dead. Not just the flashlights, the entire phones wouldn't turn on. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. We could hear breathing, ragged and uneven, and the doorknob started to turn. Ashley let out a small scream, and suddenly the footsteps were running again, but away this time, back down the hall. Our phones all powered on simultaneously, screens bright and showing no sign they'd ever been off. We didn't need to discuss it. We all ran. Not walked, not jogged, but full-on sprinted back through the hallway, down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time and nearly falling. Tommy reached the first floor first and started running toward the cafeteria, the rest of us right behind him. But when we got to the kitchen, the window we'd entered through was different. The plywood that had been partially pried away, was now completely intact, freshly nailed with new-looking nails that gleamed in our phone lights. Kevin started pulling at it frantically while Tommy ran to check the main entrance. He came back pale, saying the front doors that had been covered with old rusty nails now had new boards across them too, like someone had just finished securing them. That's when we heard the footsteps again, on the first floor this time, coming from the hallway we'd just left. Daniela found an emergency exit door near the gym that had been hidden behind a fallen locker. The door was rusted shut, but with all 5 of us pulling, we managed to force it open just enough to squeeze through. We ran to Tommy's car without looking back, and he drove out of there so fast the tires kicked up gravel that pinged off the windows. Nobody talked for the first 10 minutes of the drive back. We just sat there, catching our breath and trying to process what had happened. Finally, Kevin pulled out his phone to check the video he'd been recording. The footage was there, but it was all corrupted. Just static and weird visual glitches, except for one clear frame that showed the hallway on the 2nd floor. In that frame, you could see all of us clustered together with our backs to the camera, but there was someone else standing right behind Ashley, close enough to touch her. A man in a janitor's uniform with a name tag we couldn't quite make out. Ashley started crying when she saw it. We never reported it to anyone because what would we even say? That we broke into an abandoned school and got scared? But I did some research afterward, spending hours in the library going through old newspapers on microfilm. Found an article from 2003 about a janitor named Robert Henley, who'd refused to leave when the school was shut down after the fire. Security found him living in a supply closet on the 2nd floor, said he'd been maintaining empty classrooms and keeping attendance for students who didn't exist. They removed him forcibly, and he was committed to a psychiatric facility. Here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The article mentioned he was released in 2016, just a year before we went there. I drove past the school again last month, during the day this time. The building's been completely demolished, just an empty lot now with a future site of Westfield Shopping Center sign. But I talked to the construction foreman, and he told me something that made my skin prickle. When they were doing the demolition, they found a makeshift living space in the basement. Recent food wrappers, bottles of water, a sleeping bag, and notebooks. Dozens of notebooks filled with attendance records, lesson plans, and the same phrases we'd seen on the walls. The last entry was dated the day after our break-in, and it just said, 5 new students enrolled. They didn't stay for dismissal. The foreman said they turned everything over to the police, but nothing ever came of it. Robert Henley was never found. Sometimes I wonder if he's found another abandoned school somewhere, still taking attendance, still waiting for students who will never come. And sometimes when I can't sleep, I wonder what would have happened if that emergency door hadn't opened, if we'd been stuck there with him overnight, becoming permanent additions to his impossible class. I never thought I'd end up writing about this, but it's something that stuck with me for years. Back when I was in high school, a group of us had this routine of sneaking into places we shouldn't have been. There was an old warehouse complex a couple miles outside of town that everyone talked about. Broken windows, graffiti layered on every wall, and rusted doors that screeched whenever the wind pushed through. It wasn't just one building either. There were multiple connected halls, each darker and more cluttered than the last. For us, it was the perfect spot to kill time on weekends, daring each other to explore further than we had before. That night there were 5 of us: Ethan, Mariah, Caleb, Danielle, and me. We brought flashlights and a Bluetooth speaker pretending we weren't creeped out, but the truth is the place had this heaviness to it. The air smelled like damp concrete and burnt plastic, and there were old pallets stacked in corners that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. We laughed too loudly just to cover the silence, the kind of laughter that feels forced, where everyone's just trying not to acknowledge how tense it actually is. At one point, we ended up sitting on a ledge overlooking the main floor of the largest hall. The moonlight came in through gaps in the broken roof, casting pale streaks across the dusty ground. That's when Ethan stopped mid-sentence and pointed toward the far end of the warehouse. He swore someone was standing near the wall watching us. According to him, the figure was tall, unmoving, and wearing what looked like a rough mask. Something jagged and handmade, like cardboard or plaster that had been broken and pieced together. He said the eyes were just dark holes, fixed straight on us. None of us saw it. By the time we aimed our flashlights in that direction, there was nothing but shadows stretching between collapsed beams. Caleb laughed first, saying Ethan was just trying to spook us. Danielle joined in, teasing him about watching too many horror movies. Mariah rolled her eyes, and I remember feeling this weird mix of relief and doubt. Ethan kept insisting he hadn't imagined it. His voice cracked in a way that didn't feel like a joke, but the more he tried to explain, the less anyone took him seriously. Eventually, we brushed it off and moved on, blasting music louder, pretending nothing strange had happened. Weeks went by, and the warehouse just became another backdrop to our teenage boredom. Ethan still brought it up sometimes, but the more he mentioned the masked figure, the more the rest of us teased him. I felt guilty about that later, because even though I hadn't seen anything that night, the way he described it had been so specific. He never wavered in the details: same mask, same spot by the wall, same dead stare. Still, life kept moving. School, part-time jobs, trying to scrape together gas money. The warehouse faded into the background, like so many dumb places we used to hang out. Then came winter, and with it, news that shook everyone. A man had been attacked inside the warehouse complex. It wasn't a rumor. This time it was on the local news, with squad cars and caution tape wrapped around the entrances we'd once crawled through. The report said the victim survived, but barely. They hinted at multiple suspects, possibly squatters who'd been living there for months. Hearing that made my chest feel heavy. That word, months, stuck with me. It meant that when we were there laughing and mocking Ethan, people might have actually been inside, hidden in the same dark spaces we treated like an adventure. When I saw Ethan after that, he didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." He just looked tired, like he'd carried that memory around and finally had proof he hadn't been crazy. He told me again what he'd seen: the jagged mask, the way the figure never moved, just stood and stared. Now, knowing people had really been living there, it didn't feel like a ghost story anymore. It felt like a warning we hadn't listened to. And suddenly, all the laughter from that night replayed in my head with a sick edge to it. We had ignored the only person who might have seen the attacker long before anything happened. Police never released many details about who they arrested or what was found inside the warehouses. All we knew was that the squatters had been there for a long time, and the place was finally boarded up after the assault. Every time I drove past, I caught myself glancing at the sealed entrances, wondering how many nights those people had been hiding just a few feet from where we'd been joking around. And worse, wondering if the figure Ethan had described hadn't just been watching, but waiting. The hardest part for me wasn't the news report or the caution tape. It was realizing how blind we'd been. We treated Ethan's fear like entertainment, when in reality, he might have been the only one tuned in to the danger surrounding us. I remember lying awake the night after the story broke, replaying every sound from that warehouse. The clatter of loose metal, the drafts that felt too deliberate, the silences between our nervous laughter. Things that once seemed harmless suddenly felt like clues we had ignored. I tried asking one of the officers outside the warehouse if they'd found masks or anything like that, but he brushed me off, saying he couldn't share details. That answer left me stuck in a loop, because if Ethan truly saw someone with a mask, then maybe that wasn't just a squatter blending in. Maybe it was someone already planning something darker, rehearsing in plain sight. The idea that they could stand still and wait while a group of kids joked only yards away makes my stomach churn even now. Eventually, the warehouse was demolished. Where it stood is just an empty gravel lot with weeds poking through. You'd never guess what happened there, or the weight it carries for the handful of us who spent our teenage nights inside. We don't really talk about it anymore. Most of us moved away, scattered into different lives, but every once in a while I'll hear from Ethan. He still remembers that face, or rather that mask, as clearly as the night he saw it, and he never let us forget that he warned us. As for me, I don't go near abandoned places anymore. Not out of superstition, but out of respect for how wrong we got it that night. We laughed when we should have listened, and someone else paid the price months later. I can't say for sure if the masked figure Ethan saw was the same person responsible for the assault, but deep down, I think it was. And that thought stays with me, that sometimes the danger is right there in front of you, silent, patient, and waiting for its turn.